The land that would become Babylon began, quietly and insistently, where two rivers met and braided themselves through a flat plain. The Tigris and the Euphrates flowed like lifelines, bringing silt and fertility to a place that otherwise might have been dust and thorn. People were attracted first by water and soil, not by grand designs, and small hamlets rose along canals where grain could be coaxed from stubborn earth. Every empire begins somewhere small. Subscribe and write in the comments what moves you more, the struggle to make the earth give life or the moment those efforts became the roots of Babylon. From those modest beginnings grew a pattern of irrigation, canals, and fields that would be the practical foundation of something greater. Farmers and herders learned to harness the rivers, to channel them, to hold back their generosity until the season demanded release. Each new ditch and embankment was more than engineering. It was social glue, requiring labor, organization, and a memory of who had rights to which field when waters rose. Settlements grew into towns, and towns into cities, not because of a plan but because trade and necessity drew people together. The movement of surplus grain allowed some to specialize, to become potters, metalworkers, weavers, scribes. Those specializations in turn demanded coordination, contracts, and, eventually, governance that could translate individual effort into collective advantage. Sumerian city-states provided the earliest model nearby, but Babylon would not be their mere imitation. The city that rose on the Euphrates learned from neighbors and rivals and then folded those lessons into its own character. It borrowed gods and myths, scripts and crafts, and then reshaped them under new kings who would fashion a distinct identity at the crossroads of peoples and pathways. You can imagine the first cores of Babylon as clusters of mud brick houses, narrow alleys, and markets where the calls of merchants and the clatter of donkey hooves mingled with the scent of barbecued fish. A temple or two would hold communal rituals, and a palace would sit slightly apart, a concentration of authority. These were not yet monuments of empire, but they were the seedbed of political imagination, the place where authority learned to speak with a voice that could command canals and levy labor. Rising from this urban patchwork, power consolidated in the hands of ambitious rulers who understood that control of water meant control of life. Rulers became not just headmen but coordinators of projects that required vast manpower. In seasons of drought or flood, the ability to maintain and repair canals made a king indispensable, and his legitimacy came from delivering sustenance to the city and its dependents. Babylon's rise was accelerated by its geography as much as by its rulers. It sat on trade routes that linked the Persian Gulf to the heart of the Fertile Crescent, and its markets became places where distant goods changed hands. Bitumen and timber floated downriver, textiles and grains moved overland, and caravans brought lapis lazuli from the east and cedar from the mountains. Each transaction created wealth, and wealth begot urban elaboration, storehouses, scribes, and the beginnings of administration. Administration is the unspectacular backbone of empire, and Babylon mastered it early. Scribes who wrote in cuneiform on clay tablets learned to keep tallies, record contracts, and predict harvests. Their records turned memory into something reliable, and that reliability made it possible to tax, to plan irrigation maintenance, and to adjudicate disputes. A tablet could outlast a voice, and in that permanence lay for rulers a new kind of power. Alongside bureaucracy came law, and law curbed violence while also defining rights. Babylonian law was not yet a universal code at first, but local customs were gradually crystallized into rules that could be enforced. Over time, they would be inscribed and publicized so that people could appeal to standards rather than to the sword alone. The idea that the state could guarantee justice, or at least predict legal consequences, was a step towards social stability on a larger scale. Religion and kingship intertwined in ways that reinforced rule. Temples were not only spiritual centers but economic ones, holding land and labor and moving goods. Priests mediated between the gods and the people, and kings derived part of their legitimacy by acting as the gods' chosen representatives. This dual role of sacred and secular responsibility created a political order in which the divine and the administrative supported each other. As Babylon grew, its elites invested in monumental architecture that announced their claims to greatness. Mud brick walls thickened to resist assault, and gates were decorated to impress travelers and subject peoples alike. Palaces expanded into complexes of courtyards and rooms, where rulers could receive delegations, display tribute, and cultivate the rituals of statecraft. Architecture was language. A towering wall declared permanence, and a decorated gate proclaimed authority to all who passed. Irrigation and surplus agriculture underwrote these changes, and agricultural innovation continued to refine the city's economy. Farmers developed crop rotations, techniques for storing grain, and ways to manage salinity in fields fed by irrigation. When the land produced more than was needed, individuals could invest in craft, trade, and scholarship, and those investments solidified Babylon's role as a center of learning and craft production. Economy also meant exchange beyond city walls. Merchants threaded networks that extended to Anatolia, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau. Raw materials and finished goods created interdependence, which magnified Babylon's strategic position. With every caravan that stopped in its markets, Babylon's political sway extended outward, not always through conquest but sometimes through the soft power of commerce and credit. Conquest, when it came, was usually practical. Kings who sought territory wanted control of resources, routes, and labor. Military technology in Mesopotamia was modest compared to later ages, but armies learned to coordinate men, chariots, and logistics. When a Babylonian king moved to expand his domain, he brought engineers to bridge rivers and commanders to hold routes, knitting occupied territories into a larger administrative web. One name stands towering above the rest in narratives of Babylon's rise: Hammurabi. He is best remembered for a law code, but his significance was broader and subtler. Hammurabi consolidated power through a combination of military action, diplomatic skill, and centralization of administration. He transformed a city among many into the heart of an empire bound together by written laws, standardized measures, and an increasingly centralized bureaucracy. The Law of Hammurabi is famous because it was carved on stone and placed for public view, an early attempt to make law visible and permanent. The code covered many aspects of daily life: contracts, family relations, property, and penalties, and it reflected a world that expected rules to be enforced predictably. Some laws were harsh by modern standards, others practical. Together they signaled that the king was responsible for order and that order required codified expectation. Beyond legalism, Hammurabi invested heavily in infrastructure. Canals were repaired, temples restored, and roads enhanced. These investments were both material and symbolic, reinforcing the image of a ruler who sustained and improved the commonwealth. The interplay of law, project, and image under Hammurabi created a template that later rulers would emulate. Rule was maintenance as much as command. Religion remained central during these transformations, and Babylonian theology took on new emphases as the city rose. Babylonians venerated a pantheon of gods, but chief among them was the god associated with the city itself, who embodied its fortunes and misfortunes. Rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies tied the populace to the rhythms of the calendar and to the political order. When the gods were pleased, crops flourished and kingships seemed legitimate. When gods were not, religious explanations framed explanations for drought or invasion. The built environment reflected religious concerns at every turn. Temples rose on raised platforms called ziggurats, massive stepped structures that reached toward the sky. Their mud brick faces caught the light of dawn and dusk, and their stairways conducted priests up toward sanctuaries where offerings were made and omens read. These structures were visible metaphors for the city's connection to the divine, a stairway between earth and heaven under the care of the city. The role of ritual specialists grew with the city. Priests and scholars studied omens, read the entrails of animals, and interpreted celestial movements. This was not merely superstition, it was a systematic attempt to read patterns and to make decisions in uncertain times. Astronomy and divination became intertwined practices that informed planting, war, and political decisions, and the ability to interpret signs conferred influence. Writing, too, found fertile ground in Babylon. Cuneiform script, originally developed for the economic needs of earlier Sumerians, evolved into a versatile tool for law, poetry, and science. Scribes trained in complex schools learned to inscribe clay tablets with styluses, producing records that could be archived for decades or even centuries. This literate culture enabled accumulation of knowledge, transmission of tradition, and the consolidation of administrative practices. Libraries and archives began to appear, places where the past could be consulted and where experts kept accounts of treaties, tax lists, and myths. These collections preserved not only the mundane details of governance but also stories that gave people a shared sense of identity. The Epic of Gilgamesh and creation myths were part of this stored memory, narratives that linked the present city to ancestral archetypes and cosmic orders. The Epic of Gilgamesh in particular offered Babylon a reflective mirror. It told of kings, of friendship and loss, of quests for immortality, and of the search for meaning in a world of hardship. Listeners could recognize themselves in these ancient lines, rulers who struggled with mortality, citizens who witnessed human limits. Stories like this created cultural continuity, reminding people that their city stood within a larger human story. Art and craftsmanship flourished alongside literature and law. Potters and metalworkers produced goods that were both functional and expressive, and artisans decorated palaces with glazed tiles, reliefs, and murals. The Ishtar Gate in later centuries would become a celebrated example of such decoration, with vivid blues and mythical animals evoking both glory and religious symbolism. Even before that gate's fame, Babylonian crafts asserted a civic identity that combined utility and beauty. Cities require specialists beyond scribes and priests, and Babylon's economy supported a wide range of technicians, canal engineers, brickmakers, weavers, and bakers. Each skill had its own apprenticeship system and social networks, and mastery of craft provided status and income. The presence of such skilled labor made large projects possible and sustained the consumer culture of a capital city, where goods and services circulated daily. Trade fostered cosmopolitanism. Merchants and travelers brought not only goods but also ideas, languages, and fashions. Foreign artisans settled and exchanged techniques with local craftsmen, introducing motifs and methods that became part of the visual vocabulary. Over time, Babylon became a place of cultural hybridity where local tradition and distant innovation were braided into everyday life. This cosmopolitanism was reflected in the city's elites, who cultivated literary salons, sponsored scribal schools, and debated philosophy and theology. Education was not universal, but for those who trained in the scribal arts, the city offered opportunities for social advancement. Literacy meant access to bureaucracy and prestige, and families invested in education as a route to stable position within the administrative apparatus. The relationship between center and periphery was complex and often tense. Provincial governors and local elites negotiated between their own interests and those of the central administration, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resisting. Revolts and rebellions occurred when centralized demands pressured local resources, and the empire had to develop mechanisms of control that ranged from negotiated compromise to military suppression. This constant negotiation shaped imperial policy and often catalyzed administrative innovation. Warfare and diplomacy were twin instruments of expansion and security. Babylonian rulers often preferred alliances and treaties but would deploy force when negotiations failed. Treaties were written documents, sealed by gods and witnesses, and their violation had both legal and religious implications. Diplomacy required skilled negotiators who understood the language of tribute, marriage alliances, and mutual defense, and successful diplomacy could multiply a king's power without a single pitched battle. Military logistics were challenging in a landscape of rivers and canals, and armies depended on supply chains as much as on soldiers. Campaigns required food, transport, and secure routes, and the administration learned over time how to provision columns of troops and to maintain lines of communication. These practicalities made military campaigns an administrative test as much as a matter of courage, and the success of many campaigns rested on planning and resources. The cultural life of the city was not only elite. Markets throbbed with everyday life. Bakers slapped dough on wooden peels, fishermen mended nets, and children ran between stalls. Celebrations and street processions punctuated the calendar, turning urban space into stages where communal identity could be rehearsed. These daily rhythms tied the populace to the city's fortunes, and public rituals reminded them that their lives were woven into civic and sacred patterns. Women played crucial roles in family economies and religious life, and their participation shaped the city's social fabric. They ran households, managed domestic production, and, in many cases, had legal rights to own property and engage in contracts. Priestly roles and certain craft specialties offered women avenues for influence, while legal texts recorded disputes and settlements that revealed the texture of everyday gender relations. As time passed, Babylon's cultural output deepened in sophistication. Astronomical observations became more precise, mathematics more abstract, and physicians developed practical therapies. The Babylonians charted the heavens with the eyes of careful observers, noting planetary motions and eclipses. These records would later feed into broader scientific traditions, and the precision of Babylonian observation made them notable across centuries. The idea of empire required also narratives of origin and destiny. Myths and genealogies were crafted to position Babylon within a cosmic plan, often elevating its patron deities and founding kings. These stories gave political claims a divine gloss, binding subjects to rulers through shared mythic frameworks. When a new dynasty rose, it often sought legitimacy by invoking these ancestral narratives and by placing itself in continuity with primeval foundations. Kingship itself was a performance, built on ceremony, imagery, and ritual speech. Coronation ceremonies tied the ruler to the gods, festivals displayed royal generosity, and inscriptions celebrated achievements for posterity. Monumental inscriptions were as important as deeds, for a king's reputation and the memory of subjects and successors mattered for the family's prospects and the city's stability. Consequently, many kings invested in public monuments that would last beyond the span of their own lifetimes. Architecture and urban planning reflected not only defense and function but also symbolism. Open plazas, processional avenues, and temple precincts choreographed how citizens and visitors experienced power. The ordering of space communicated who belonged where and what roles different places played in civic life. A city's map was a text to be read. Courtyards and gates, gardens and shrines all spoke of hierarchy and religious ordering. One of Babylon's most enduring legends is the Hanging Gardens, a terraced green wonder said to have defied the dry plain and the expectations of visitors. Whether or not they existed exactly as described, the story captures a human longing to shape nature into ordered beauty and to display mastery over environment. Gardens became symbols of royal privilege and the ability to bend water and earth into aesthetic form, a statement that civilization could create paradise amid the marshes. Material culture carried memory as well. Cylinder seals rolled unique impressions into clay, marking contracts and possessions, and pottery styles signaled shifts in taste and contact. These artifacts, mundane in daily use, now travel across millennia to speak to us of hands that made and used them. Archaeology unrolls these threads, and in piecing them together we learn not only what people did but also what they valued and imagined. The processes of urban growth also created tensions. Salinization from irrigation could degrade farmland if not managed, and the ecological costs of expansion sometimes produced stress on agricultural output. Disease followed density, and the hormonal rhythms of cities included periods of crisis that required collective responses. Rulers and administrators had to balance immediate needs with long-term sustainability, a challenge familiar to any urban planner. Babylon's political fortunes waxed and waned in response to internal dynamics and external pressures. Dynasties rose as others fell, and foreign conquerors sometimes sat on Babylonian thrones. Assyrians, Kassites, and later foreign powers contested Babylonian control, but the city repeatedly reinvented itself, maintaining cultural continuity even when political domination shifted. Resilience became a hallmark. The city's cultural gravity outlived many of its rulers. When foreign rulers appropriated Babylon, they often embraced its rituals and administrative systems rather than erased them. Conquerors sought legitimacy by positioning themselves as restorers of temples or patrons of Babylonian gods. This pattern reveals an important truth. Babylonian institutions and forms of speech were powerful resources for legitimization, and occupying rulers learned that adopting local traditions could strengthen their rule. Babylonian identity was thus adaptable. It could absorb outsiders and reshape them, incorporating new elements into a core of shared practice. Religious syncretism and linguistic accommodation allowed the city to remain a hub even as empires changed. This cultural elasticity meant that Babylon's influence extended beyond the boundaries of any single political configuration. Language played a role in continuity and change as well. Akkadian and later dialects were used in administration and literature, while local languages persisted in everyday speech. Cuneiform persisted as a medium of record even as other scripts and languages circulated, and the ability to read clay tablets became a specialized skill that connected successive generations to a shared written tradition. The continuity of script anchored memory in a physical medium. Religion, law, craft, and administration together produced a complex social order that could govern large populations over centuries. That order was never static, it evolved as new challenges demanded innovation. Fiscal instruments were adapted, legal codes expanded, and ritual calendars were adjusted to reflect new realities. This capacity for institutional evolution allowed Babylon to remain influential across decades and centuries. The city also produced thinkers and technicians whose work echoed far beyond its walls. Mathematicians developed numeric systems that influenced astronomical computation, and medical practitioners compiled diagnoses and prescriptions that informed later traditions. These scholarly achievements were not isolated, they emerged from a social ecosystem where scribes, temples, and rulers supported inquiry as a useful resource for governance and religious practice. Diplomacy with far-flung powers became a refined art, and marriage alliances, gift exchanges, and negotiated boundaries created networks of obligation and advantage. Envoys traveled bearing letters sealed in clay, and these diplomatic correspondences shaped geopolitical landscapes. Treaties often stipulated mutual support or trade terms, and the habit of formalized agreement stabilized relations in a region prone to shifting alliances. City planning and the aesthetics of public space contributed to civic pride and identity. Streets, gates, and markets were arranged to balance defense and accessibility, dignity and commerce. Public works such as reservoirs and bridges signaled the rulers' investment in the common good, and their upkeep demonstrated ongoing capacity for governance. When infrastructure failed, people noticed. When it functioned, it became background to daily life, taken for granted yet essential. Babylon's artistic traditions influenced neighboring cultures and were themselves shaped by contact. Decorative motifs traveled along trade routes, and artisans adapted foreign motifs into local idioms. The result was a visual language in which bulls, dragons, floral patterns, and celestial symbols could be read both locally and regionally as markers of shared taste and religious ideas. Foodways and culinary life are another way to glimpse daily Babylonian life. Markets offered grains, fish, legumes, and vegetables, and spices brought from afar flavored dishes. Feasting rituals punctuated both religious festivals and political occasions, and the sharing of food was an essential practice in forming alliances and demonstrating hospitality. The palate of the city thus reflected its connectedness to wider networks of exchange. Education for elites emphasized memorization, composition in cuneiform, and mastery of administrative skills, producing a bureaucratic class that could manage empires. Students practiced on clay tablets, copying texts until forms and formulas became second nature. This educational discipline created a professional corps whose predictability made large-scale governance possible and whose intellectual labor preserved knowledge across generations. Music and performance life accompanied ritual and ceremony, with instruments and song marking sacred and secular moments. Musicians held respected positions in temples and courts, and musical performance heightened the emotional impact of processions, banquets, and prayers. Cultural life in Babylon was thus multisensory, involving sight, sound, taste, and touch, all braided into experiences that made civic identity palpable. The city's legal institutions continued to refine civil procedure, with courts that heard disputes and officials who recorded verdicts. Contracts were made concrete by seals and witnesses, ensuring that commerce could proceed with some expectation of enforceability. Legal forms reinforced social stability by offering predictable outcomes, and they also revealed the moral and economic assumptions of Babylonian society. Over the centuries, Babylon attracted scholars who compiled observations on plants, animals, and medical remedies, creating proto-scientific catalogs that combined empirical detail with theological framing. Herbalists and diagnosticians worked from accumulated experience and trial, and their recipes and instructions were preserved on tablets. This empirical memory fed into practical knowledge that improved lives, even as it remained enmeshed with ritual and belief. The visual vocabulary of royal power remained consistent: processions, reliefs of victorious hunts or wars, and inscriptions that celebrated lineages. Kings staged events that dramatized their relation to the gods and to their subjects, reinforcing narratives of protection and abundance. Public spectacle functioned politically, producing loyalty through awe and gratitude rather than coercion alone. Archaeology has since revealed layers of construction and reconstruction, showing how the city was built, rebuilt, and repurposed over centuries. Excavations unearthed streets and walls, administrative tablets, and ritual objects, each layer a palimpsest of human activity. These finds allow us to reconstruct not only chronology but the texture of daily life, what people ate, where they worshipped, and how they managed conflict. Babylon's fall and revival cycles are themselves part of its story. The city could be sacked and repopulated, conquered and cherished, destroyed and rebuilt in different guises. Each destruction left scars, and each rebuilding carried forward fragments of the past, sometimes in continuity and sometimes in radical transformation. Such cycles remind us that urban life is resilient yet vulnerable, shaped by forces both human and environmental. Roman and later Hellenistic authors would add layers of interpretation to Babylon's story, sometimes mythologizing its wonders, sometimes moralizing its decadence. Later religious texts would use Babylon as a symbol, sometimes negative, sometimes ambiguous, reflecting the city's enormous cultural footprint. Over centuries, Babylon became not only a historical place but a rhetorical one, a symbol in stories across cultures. Modern archaeology and scholarship have sought to disentangle fact from legend, to understand Babylon on its own terms rather than through later tropes. Scholars study tablets, inscriptions, and ruins to reconstruct economic systems, social hierarchies, and religious life. Yet every generation remakes the past in its own image, so the academic reconstruction is itself a human enterprise shaped by modern assumptions and questions. Excavation has also raised ethical questions about the stewardship of ancient heritage. Objects removed from sites have traveled to museums, fueling debates over ownership, conservation, and the rights of descendant communities. The story of Babylon's artifacts continues the political life of the ancient city, as modern nations claim, display, and sometimes repatriate objects that carry symbolic weight. The city's legacy is both material and mnemonic. Its legal forms influenced later law codes, its astronomical observations fed into later sciences, and its literary corpus contributed to shared Near Eastern stories. Even where direct transmission is difficult to trace, Babylonian concepts of law, administration, and urban ritual resonate in the structure of later states. The city's influence is diffuse but persistent, a cultural sediment beneath many later institutions. Visiting the site today, a traveler encounters mud brick ruins and modern reconstructions that gesture toward past grandeur. There is a strange intimacy in touching ancient clay tablets or walking where processions once moved, and the sense of continuity can be profound. Yet the ruins also remind us of fragility, a once dominant city reduced to layers that scholars and visitors piece together with imagination and care. Babylon's narratives have been used for many purposes over centuries, from imperial propaganda to artistic imagination. Poets and novelists have found in Babylon a stage for human drama, decadence, hubris, wonder, and the interplay of human aspiration and divine caprice. Its resonance in literature shows how a city can become an archetype, embodying ideas larger than itself while remaining rooted in specific landscapes and histories. The story of Babylon also challenges us to think about how civilizations achieve greatness and how they manage complexity. It suggests that urban wealth arises from a matrix of environment, technology, social cooperation, and ideological structures. It also reminds us that empires rely on trust in written agreements, trust in water systems, trust in priests and administrators, and that maintaining that trust requires continuous labor. In the imagination, Babylon is at once ancient and modern, a mirror in which contemporary debates about governance, science, and culture can find precedents. The administrative solutions the Babylonians devised, record-keeping, legal formalization, standardized measures, are recognizably modern in function if not in form. Understanding their experiments offers perspective on how institutions develop in response to human problems. The human stories within Babylon remain compelling: a scribe laboring over a tablet by a oil lamp, a farmer negotiating canal rights with a neighbor, a priest reading omens at dawn, a king commissioning a gate to define his reign. These are intimate moments, rarely recorded in detail, yet they animate the scaffolding of empire. Imagining these lives helps us see empire not as monolith, but as a matrix of individual choices and small acts of cooperation and conflict. Language, too, carries the resonance of Babylon forward. Words and phrases that circulated in Akkadian and other languages of the region traveled, translated into new idioms, and sometimes preserved in later religious texts. The persistence of certain terms in legal and ritual contexts across centuries shows how language can outlast political regimes, carrying ideas that shape behavior long after specific rulers are forgotten. Babylon's art and iconography continue to inspire modern designers and storytellers who adopt its motifs for symbolic effect. The image of the lion as protector, the dragon as cosmic force, the ornamental rosette, these motifs reappear in artistic languages that seek the weight of antiquity. This cultural recycling testifies to the city's capacity to generate images that feel archetypal and emotionally resonant. Yet the past is not a single story, it is plural, contested, and open to reinterpretation. New findings may revise our understanding of Babylonian chronology, social relations, and technology, and each discovery invites fresh narratives. That epistemic humility is part of what makes the study of ancient cities endlessly engaging. The past is a puzzle whose pieces we keep rearranging as we learn more and as our questions change. Every discovery rewrites a piece of the past. Subscribe and share in the comments what excites you more, finding new answers or realizing how much is still unknown. For the modern listener, Babylon can be both a historical subject and a mirror for contemporary anxieties about urban life and governance. Its successes in administration, law, and culture remind us that complex societies can produce astonishing achievements. Its failures and collapses caution against complacency, showing how fragile systems can be when ecological, political, and social pressures meet. Imagining a day in prime Babylon is a way to connect with human continuity. Dawn would bring the calls of bakers, the first barges down the river, and priests beginning morning rituals. By midday, the markets would bustle, students would practice cuneiform in schoolrooms, and administrators would meet to discuss the week's work. At dusk, processions or household feast might create a sense of shared belonging before the city settled into night. The archaeology of Babylon has also fostered international collaboration, as scholars from many countries combine linguistic skill, scientific methods, and interpretive frameworks. Multidisciplinary teams use soil analysis, remote sensing, and philology to reconstruct ancient environments and social systems. This collaborative work underscores that Babylon's story is a shared human inheritance, one that benefits from multiple perspectives and methods. In thinking about legacy, one must reckon with the ways that later empires both stored and reframed Babylon's achievements. The Persians, Greeks, and Romans encountered a cultural memory that they sometimes admired and sometimes reinterpreted. Each encounter added layers to Babylon's reputation, transforming it into a repository of both pride and cautionary tale for later rulers. Museums and libraries today preserve Babylonia's texts and artifacts, allowing public access to material that once lay buried for millennia. These holdings enable scholars to translate and analyze texts that reveal daily schedules, dead records, and prayers. Public exhibitions invite wider audiences to imagine the city, and in doing so they participate in the ongoing life of Babylonian culture. Babylon's rise from rivers to empire shows how human ingenuity, when combined with environmental opportunity and social cooperation, can create complex and durable forms of civilization. It was not inevitable, yet it also had a logic. Canals begot surplus, surplus begot specialization, specialization begot administration, and administration begot empire. Each step carried risks and rewards, and each relied on the trust that people had in institutions and in one another. Ultimately, the story of Babylon is a human story about placemaking, about how communities organize themselves to capture the possibility of a particular landscape. The city's monuments, laws, and literature are evidence of a sustained attempt to order the world, to make human life manageable and meaningful in a challenging environment. As such, Babylon can be read as an ambitious experiment in social engineering, one whose traces continue to teach us about the costs and achievements of collective life. The city that rose beside two rivers came to mean more than geography. It became an idea, a set of practices, a repository of knowledge, and a symbol of human capacity to build and to imagine. Its rise was gradual and contingent, rooted in irrigation and trade, administered by scribes and priests, and articulated in law and ritual. The echo of Babylon reaches us across millennia, not only through artifacts in museums, but through the very forms of governance and scholarship that it helped to birth. The city of Babylon rose along the life-giving waters of the Euphrates as if someone had taken the river and folded it into a shape of brick and song. Its walls gathered people and red clay, its gates listened to the passage of traders, warriors, and farmers who came to meet fate and market. At the center of this scene stood one man whose name would be carved into stone and memory, Hammurabi, a king whose reign would stitch law, order, and the gods into a single, enduring fabric. Hammurabi was not born into a world that awaited him like a stage already set. He belonged to a lineage of Amorite rulers who had moved into Mesopotamia and taken the language, the script, and the cities as if adopting them into a household. When he assumed kingship around the 18th century BCE, he inherited more than a city. He inherited a fragile tapestry of small states, competing temples, and shifting alliances. He knew that to rule Babylon was to speak in many voices, those of merchants, priests, farmers, and soldiers, and to find a grammar that could hold them together. His early years as ruler were marked by cautious consolidation. Hammurabi worked to secure the loyalty of neighboring cities, sometimes through diplomacy and sometimes through force, weaving alliances and breaking them as needed. He understood warfare not simply as violence but as a way to redraw networks of obligation, bringing distant towns into Babylon's orbit while making the capital itself a hub of administration and law. But his ambition exceeded conquest alone. Hammurabi imagined a state in which law would be the visible backbone of order. He saw that armies could take land and kings could claim titles, but lasting order would come from rules that people could point to and understand. A modern listener might picture a courtroom, but in Hammurabi's world the courtroom was braided with the temple, the marketplace, and the irrigation canal. Law touched every thread of daily life. To make law effective, he depended on the scribes, those trained hands that could translate thought into cuneiform clay. These scribes were the technicians of memory, writing contracts, recording loans, and inscribing decrees. They were trained in the art of precision, learning a script that required them to wedge a reed into soft clay and capture a shape that would outlast generations and floods. The most famous result of this marriage between king and scribe is the stele known to us as the Code of Hammurabi, a basalt monument on which more than 280 laws were inscribed from prologue to epilogue. At the top of the stele, a relief shows Hammurabi receiving symbols of authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, making clear that law was not merely human arbitration but a divinely sanctioned order. This image framed the laws not as arbitrary decrees but as instruments of cosmic fairness, descended through the king to the people. Hammurabi began the text with a prologue that set a tone of moral guardianship. He claimed to have been chosen by the gods to bring about the welfare of the people, to vanquish the wicked and protect the weak, and to make justice reign in the land. This rhetorical move was crucial. It placed the king and his laws within a cosmic narrative rather than a mere political one, ensuring that obedience felt like piety. The gods of Babylon were not distant metaphors but active participants in the governance of society. Shamash, as the sun and judge, was portrayed as handing down authority, while Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, rose in reputation during Hammurabi's reign as the city's divine protector. Temples were both spiritual centers and fiscal hubs. They owned land, lent grain and silver, and mediated social disputes, so religion and law were economically entangled as well as ideologically bound. The code itself moved through spheres of life as if sweeping a wide net. It addressed family relations, property disputes, commercial transactions, professional responsibility, and punitive measures. Many laws read with a practical clarity. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and caused death, the builder would be put to death. If the building harmed a child, then a social calculus decided compensation. The tone mixes rigorous calculation with moral gravity, making consequences predictable while insisting they reflect a higher order. Family law consumed a large portion of the code because family was the basic unit of production and inheritance. Marriage contracts, dowries, and rights of divorce were not private matters but public business. A husband's duty to provide and a wife's rights to her dowry were spelled out to prevent disputes from tearing households apart, because household stability meant agricultural productivity and civic peace. Paternity, inheritance, and adoption received careful attention as well. The code detailed what a son could inherit and how a wife's children would be treated if she bore children before marriage. Adoption was a recognized institution, a formal way to ensure continuity when biological heirs were absent, and it required recorded agreements to bind parties across years and generations. In those clauses, one hears a desire to keep resources within regulated bounds and to prevent envy and violence born of unclear lineage. Slavery existed in Babylonian society, and the code managed its contours with the same administrative precision as other relationships. People could be enslaved for debt or as prisoners of war, and slave ownership carried duties and regulations. Slaves could own property in some circumstances and seek legal redress, making their status complex rather than wholly outside the law. The code's regulations attempted to integrate them into the same moral economy that governed free citizens. Commerce and trade were lifeblood for Babylon, which sat at the crossroads of long-distance routes and local markets. The code established rules for loans, interest rates, agency, and the penalties for fraudulent measures and dishonest weights. Merchants traveled overland and by river, and their contracts had to be reliable. Scribes recorded obligations on clay tablets so that trust could be replaced by tangible proof. Agriculture, too, required regulation because Mesopotamia's prosperity depended on irrigation and the careful division of water and land. Laws concerning canals, field boundaries, and duties for tenants reveal the preoccupation with sustaining a landscape that could yield crops year after year. When irrigation failed, famine and social unrest threatened, so predictable rules about who maintained what and who should be compensated held the society together like a network of levees. Even professional ethics found a place in the code. Surgeons, artisans, and builders faced penalties for malpractice because a profession's trust could not be left to whim. A surgeon who injured a noble might pay with his own hand or his life, while compensation could be set when the patient was of lower status, a harsh but formalized system that tied social rank to legal outcomes. These laws codified the expectation that expertise came with responsibility, and that the state could enforce standards. Trade and credit and the use of interest were bound up with social obligations as well. Loans were often made in grain or silver, and repayment terms had to be recorded and witnessed. The code sets ceilings on interest in some cases and prescribes fines for fraud, aiming to stabilize credit relationships that could otherwise destabilize families and communities if debt spiraled into servitude. The courtroom process in Hammurabi's Babylon was partly theatrical and partly administrative. Judges heard cases, examined witnesses, and considered written contracts, but decisions could also invoke oaths to the gods and the ritual authority of temples. The oath, a spoken call to the gods to punish falsehood, was an important legal instrument, binding via sacred fear the parties who might otherwise lie for gain. Witnesses and documentary evidence were central to outcomes. Contracts and receipts were kept on clay tablets, and their presence in court could make or break a claim. This reliance on documentary proof encouraged a culture of record-keeping. The clay tablets that survive today are testimony to a people who understood memory as something that could be externalized and archived. The code's punishments were famously severe to modern ears, and the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, resonates across many of its provisions. But beneath the stark phrasing often lay a graduated logic. Penalties varied depending on the social status of the offender and the victim, reflecting the hierarchical structure of Babylonian society. Compensation in silver or labor sometimes replaced physical retribution, offering a calculable alternative to bodily punishment. This hierarchy is a recurring theme: social rank, noble, commoner, slave, structured expectations, and penalties. A noble's injury demanded different redress than a commoner's, and a code that enshrined hierarchy did so both to manage power and to ensure the smooth functioning of a stratified economy. This social scaffold allowed the king to balance competing interests, giving elites enough privilege to maintain loyalty while crafting rules to protect the less powerful from arbitrary abuse. Hammurabi himself, however, cultivated an image of impartial guardian. His rhetoric presented the king as a shepherd who would prevent the strong from devouring the weak, an image reinforced by the prologue that prided him on protecting widows and orphans. This language reached beyond mere political propaganda. It offered a moral justification for centralized authority at a time when local powers might otherwise have ruled unchecked. The Steele's epilogue echoes this motive, warning judges that failure to administer justice would bring divine and royal retribution. Judges were reminded that neglect or corruption would be punished, a measure designed to keep local magistrates accountable to the king's standard. Through such warnings, Hammurabi extended his reach into corners of the realm, making law a tool of unification as much as of governance. Religious ceremony and temple law were woven into the legal fabric in multiple ways. Temples not only housed the gods but also served as courts and banks. Priests could act as witnesses, and the temple calendar regulated when business could be legally conducted. This integration meant that law had a ritual dimension. Compliance could be framed as obedience to both king and deity, and sanctions could be understood as cosmic as well as civic consequences. The connection between king and god encouraged a theology of responsibility. To break the law was to offend the god who had entrusted power to the king. Shamash, as the judge among deities, was invoked to enforce the moral order, and the temple rituals that accompanied legal oaths made the gods co-enforcers. This ensured that Hammurabi's laws carried weight beyond the immediate reach of his officials, as fear of divine punishment extended enforcement into the private conscience of citizens. Hammurabi also governed through public works, building walls, canals, and temples to solidify his legitimacy and to improve life in Babylon. These projects required organized labor, resources, and planning, and they demonstrated the practical benefits of centralized rule. When a king feeds the city by managing water or shields it by shoring up walls, his decrees feel less like abstract edicts and more like tangible improvements to daily life. His military campaigns were likewise instruments of state formation. Hammurabi subdued neighboring cities and integrated them into an expanding polity, but his wars were calibrated to create interdependence rather than mere plunder. Conquered cities retained local elites and legal traditions in many cases, yet they now owed tribute and recognition to Babylon, which meant that Hammurabi's code functioned as a normative umbrella under which diverse customs could continue while aligning politically. Diplomacy was as important as force. Hammurabi forged treaties and used marriage alliances to cement relationships, understanding that stable networks of obligation could be woven through vows as much as spears. These ties allowed him to manage far-flung territories by creating a lattice of loyalties that centered on Babylon as the hub. The material reality of Babylon, the brick streets, the bazaars, the fragrant temple fires, was recorded in the documents Hammurabi inspired. Clay tablets reveal mundane details: the price of barley, the wages of a day laborer, the penalties for a shepherd who allowed sheep to stray. These specifics illuminate the code's practical focus. It was not a philosophical treatise, but a toolkit for ordering everyday life in a complex economy. Language mattered too. The code was written in Akkadian, the common Semitic tongue of Babylon, but it drew on Sumerian legal traditions that were older and often cited in administrative practice. This linguistic layering shows how Hammurabi's laws were both innovative and conservative. They synthesized existing practices into a single corpus that could guide a diverse population. The scribes who compiled the code were therefore translators of custom into statute, shaping continuity through written form. Women in Hammurabi's Babylon had rights that were legally recognized even if they remained socially constrained. Dowries were protected, wives could initiate divorce under certain conditions, and widows could inherit in specified ways. Yet the code also enshrined patriarchal assumptions, and women often operated through family structures. Their legal visibility depended on kinship ties and the social status of husbands and fathers. Children and family dynamics were subjects of careful regulation because a stable lineage ensured economic continuity. Laws addressed education costs, paternal duties, and the penalties for neglect. The state thus intervened in intimate matters to secure inheritance lines and to protect dependents who, without law, might become vulnerable to exploitation. Medicine and healing practices were regulated with surprising specificity. Medical practitioners and midwives had their duties and faced severe punishment for malpractice, and fees for medical care were officially set in many instances. The code's attention to medical liability shows a society that expected professionals to be reliable and accountable, and that accepted state oversight in areas that today we might consider private. Property disputes, boundary marks, and the dangers of flooding shaped a large portion of judicial work. Mesopotamia's flatlands made precise demarcation essential, and scribal records show that neighbors often took disputes to court when fields were improperly irrigated or when property markers were moved. The law provided remedies and set precedents to prevent such disputes from spiraling into violence, because land was both livelihood and identity for many people. Trade networks extended Babylon's influence beyond its walls, bringing in goods, ideas, and people from Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf. Hammurabi's laws helped to regulate these exchanges by providing reliable rules for commerce and conflict resolution. The standardization of certain practices under his code made transactions more predictable and fostered trust among merchants who traveled long distances. The physical stele recording the code is itself a story of survival. While its top relief and much of its text have weathered the centuries, the very existence of that inscribed monument tells us that Hammurabi wanted his laws to be public and permanent. The stele was placed in a temple where all could see it, a public archive meant to be read aloud by officials and, through repetition, taught to communities so that the laws would be known rather than hidden. Modern discovery and decipherment of the code is another chapter of the story. The stele was found much later, and during the 19th century, scholars like Henry Rawlinson helped to unlock cuneiform secrets. The rediscovery of Hammurabi's laws reshaped modern understanding of law's deep antiquity, reminding later ages that codified justice existed long before modern nation-states and that ancient kings also sought to bind their peoples by the force of written rule. The code's influence spread beyond its immediate era. Later Mesopotamian rulers quoted and adapted Hammurabi's laws, and the notion of a codified legal corpus became a model for other societies. In this way, Hammurabi's project was part of a longer history in which societies turned custom into written rule to manage complexity and to legitimize authority. Yet there is nuance to the code's claim to fairness. Its very structure, tying penalties to social rank and endorsing capital punishments, reveals a world where inequality was institutionalized. To listen to these laws is to hear a delicate balancing act between protecting the weak and preserving existing hierarchies, between offering compensation and enforcing harsh deterrence, between divine sanction and administrative control. The rhetorical power of the prologue and epilogue shaped how the laws were read and remembered. By framing law as a divine gift, Hammurabi bolstered his own image and embedded legal compliance into religious duty. It is easy to overlook the political ingenuity of this move. It centralized power not merely through force, but through the sacralization of administrative rules. The temples that supported the code also became repositories of knowledge and social power. Priests could issue contracts, serve as judges, and manage temple estates, making them intermediaries between king and populace. The code negotiated this power by acknowledging temple roles while also asserting the king's ultimate legal authority, a necessary compromise in a world where gods were active members of political life. Hammurabi's reforms were administrative as much as legal. He reorganized tax systems, standardized measures, and streamlined ways to collect tribute and labor for state projects. This streamlining made the state more efficient and allowed Babylon to sustain larger-scale endeavors, from public building campaigns to sustained military operations. His correspondence and archival records show a ruler attentive to details. Letters discuss supply lines, grain stockpiles, and personnel. Hammurabi's regime depended on a bureaucracy that could implement policy, and the code was one among many tools to align local officials with royal expectations. The king's reach thus extended through the paper trail of tablets, the loyalty of scribes, and the compliance of judges. Religion justified the state's monopoly on the use of force. The king acted in the name of gods, and military campaigns were often described as liberations conducted under divine mandate. This theology made rebellion not merely a political crime but a religious one, allowing Hammurabi to claim moral high ground in suppressing dissent and annexing territory. At the same time, the king cultivated patronage through generosity to temples and the redistribution of resources. Festivities, temple endowments, and public works demonstrated his capacity to provide and protected him from charges of greed. These gestures bound elites and commoners to the monarchy by revealing tangible benefits of allegiance. The legal culture Hammurabi nurtured had a pedagogy. Scribal schools taught a class of officials the code and administrative techniques necessary for governance. Training new scribes ensured continuity and made legal knowledge a specialized field, creating a class of literate bureaucrats who mediated between text and people. Their role in interpreting and applying laws shaped how justice was actually done at the local level. Linguistic evidence suggests that laws were not simply recited but could be debated in court, where interpretation mattered. Judges and lawyers drew on precedents, custom, and written law to argue cases, creating a living legal tradition rather than a static archive. This process of interpretation meant that the code functioned more as a reference than a set of immutable rules, adaptable to new circumstances through practice. Hammurabi's own personality is glimpsed through fragments of correspondence and the calculated tone of the code. He presents himself as pious, balanced, and pragmatic, a ruler who could combine theological rhetoric with administrative competence. Whether he truly believed himself to be a vessel of divine justice or whether he used the language of the gods for political legitimacy, the result was the same: a durable system that fused sacred and secular authority. The broader historical context is also instructive. Hammurabi's reign came after the fall of earlier powers and during an age when city-states vied for regional dominance. His success in uniting many of them under Babylonian control gave him the platform to make law serve empire. The Code of Hammurabi therefore stands not only as a legal text but as an artifact of statecraft, a way to impose uniform norms across diverse communities. Archaeological evidence fills in the daily picture: clay tablets with receipts, legal complaints written by farmers, and administrative lists that detail grain rations and labor obligations. These mundane records corroborate the code's concerns and show how law met life in the marketplace and the field. Together, text and artifact reconstruct a world where legal mechanisms lubricated social and economic exchanges. The code also reveals anxieties of the age: fear of theft, concern over dishonest contracts, and the vulnerability of widows and orphans. By addressing these anxieties in law, Hammurabi sought to reduce sources of conflict that might otherwise become political threats. In doing so, he achieved a measure of social engineering, steering behavior through predictable sanctions and rewards. Religious festivals and civic rituals reinforced legal norms by making them part of communal memory. During certain public events, laws might be read aloud, reminding citizens of the king's role as both protector and punisher. Rituals thus served as a cultural amplifier for law, embedding statutes within a shared repertoire of public acts. The steel's survival and eventual discovery centuries later is a testament to the resilience of written rule. Objects like the steel and the thousands of clay tablets that survive are not merely relics, they are voices from the past that continue to speak. When scholars pieced together the code, they lifted a veil on ancient governance and revealed a civilization committed to ordering human relations through a combination of piety and procedure. Scholars have debated Hammurabi's legacy. Was he an enlightened lawgiver, a shrewd autocrat, or both at once? The evidence suggests he was a pragmatist who used law as a tool to consolidate power while genuinely attempting to maintain social order. His code stands as an early experiment in balancing deterrence, compensation, and divine sanction to create a relatively predictable legal environment. The notion that law could be made public, fixed in writing, and enforced across a diverse population was revolutionary in its own historical terms. Hammurabi's code did not invent law, but it centralized and formalized it in a way that influenced subsequent generations. Its legacy is the idea that justice can be institutionalized, that words carved in stone can shape behavior long after a ruler is gone. The steel's dramatic image of king and god still conveys a message about the source of authority. Rulers claim power by placing themselves in a sacred continuum. In Hammurabi's vision, law radiated from this sacred exchange to touch the marketplace and the private home alike. It was a claim that governance should be both visible and morally accountable, a claim that resonated across the ancient Near East. Reading Hammurabi today can feel like entering a different moral universe, but it also offers surprising continuity. Modern debates about the role of the state, the protection of the weak, and the balance between retribution and restitution find distant echoes in his laws. The difference lies in scale and values, yet the core question remains: how to order a society so that people can live and work together without descending into violence. The Code of Hammurabi, then, is a mirror reflecting a civilization's attempt to create order, not by whim, but by the slow work of inscription and administration. It is a political manifesto couched in legal detail, a relic of a world where temple and palace bound together to govern flow of water, grain, and people. Its survival invites us to consider how law shapes lives and how rulers forge legitimacy through visible rules. At the level of daily practice, the code meant that disputes had predictable forums and penalties, and that ordinary people could appeal to doctrines written in stone. This predictability helped markets to flourish, labor to be organized, and public works to be maintained. By providing a shared reference point for conduct, the code reduced uncertainty and made large-scale cooperation more feasible. The ritual aura surrounding law made obedience an ethical choice as much as a pragmatic one. To swear an oath and invoke shamash was to appeal to cosmic punishment, and for many citizens this was a genuine deterrent. The intertwining of sacred fear with civic duty therefore created a double layer of accountability, social and supernatural. Hammurabi's reforms also reflected a consciousness of time. He sought to make his name permanent through the durability of carved law. Kings have always been concerned with memory, and laws carved in stone were a way to ensure that future generations would recognize the king's role in creating order. The stele stands as a monument to the ambition to be remembered not only as a warrior but as a solver of social problems. The legal corpus was not static after Hammurabi. Later rulers and local courts adapted, amended, and applied its principles to new circumstances. Laws that were once clear could become ambiguous as societies changed, and the living practice of law involved negotiation, reinterpretation, and occasional reform. This dynamism shows that even the most durable legal texts exist within a living culture that continually shapes and is shaped by them. In the end, Hammurabi's achievement was a blend of pious rhetoric, administrative skill, and political calculation. He made law a public act with divine clout, creating a framework for order that stretched across city walls and fields. Whether one calls him a lawgiver, a monarch, or a religious mediator, his enduring contribution is the demonstration that written law can anchor a complex society. As night falls over modern Babylon's ruins, we can still feel the imprint of that ancient insistence on order. The clay tablets, the stele, and the memory of rituals all testify to a society that worked hard to translate disorder into rule. Hammurabi's reign reminds us that the attempt to make justice visible, durable, and binding is an ancient and persistent human project. Listening to the record of his laws, we encounter a civilization preoccupied with fairness, accountability, and the smooth functioning of daily life. Hammurabi's voice comes to us filtered through clay and centuries, but it speaks a clear purpose: to make human relations predictable and to bind them to a moral universe governed by gods and kings. In that ambition, we find a story that continues to resonate, a long conversation between authority and society that began in the mud of the Euphrates and reaches us now through carved stone and careful script. There is a particular hush that falls over a plain as the sun lowers, a hush heavy with dust and footsteps and the slow, deliberate sound of a city bending toward the sky. In the days of ancient Babylon, that hush belonged to a people who measured their lives in the rhythm of floods and the pattern of stars. They spoke in a language shaped by reeds and canals, and they built with mud and aspiration, dreaming and making with hands that knew both routine toil and sudden invention. When we speak of the Tower of Babel, we hear one story, but we must imagine many lives folded into that single telling: masons whose palms were scarred by brick, priests who read omens by night, mothers who handed bread across thresholds, and a king who wanted his name to last. The tower is not simply an edifice, it is a condensation of desire. To build upward in a world that felt bound by the horizon was to declare mastery over place, over chaos, over fate itself. Babylon rose beside the Euphrates, where the river gave and took life in equal measure, where canals cut the land into neat parcels of green and mud, and where date palms shaded the paths of traders. The city was a lattice of markets and courtyards, of temples and winding alleys, and at its heart stood a stepped mass that reached toward heaven in tiers like a mountain laid down by hands. That structure, later called a ziggurat, was not merely architecture, it was a statement about the cosmos and the ordering of human space beneath the dome of stars. Imagine the building of such a thing. Men and women shaped mud into bricks and left them to dry under the same sun that burned their shoulders. They stacked them with bitumen between, a tarry glue that smelled of earth and the river, and they hauled wagons over rutted lanes to the scaffoldings where men pounded stakes and strung rope. There was the clang of metal tools, the soft thud of clay, the sharp commands from master builders, and the constant counting of progress, as if each course of stones marked not only height but historical claim. The ancient sources do not give us a single, neat picture, and that is part of the tower's power. In the Hebrew Bible, the tale is brief and moral, a parable of ambition and divine displeasure. In Babylonian memory, something like a lofty shrine to the sky did exist, often associated with the Temple of Marduk and a structure known in later texts as Etemenenki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. When these threads are woven together, the story becomes a palimpsest where memory and myth ride over one another in the same hand. To understand why a people would erect a monument that sought to meet the heavens, we must step into their cosmology. The ancient Mesopotamians imagined the world as a flat disk under a vaulted sky, a structure where gods and humans occupied distinct realms but where contact was sought through ritual and temple. The ziggurat was a ladder, a stairway to the stars, a place where priests ascended in garments bright with ritual dye to commune, to intercede, and to keep the balance between mortality and divinity. It was an instrument of order as much as devotion, and it made visible what had been mythic. Ambition in Babylon was not mere vanity. Kings built tall because height signified protection and power. A tall temple signaled a city favored by gods, a city that could shelter its people against cosmic chaos. When a ruler rebuilt a ziggurat, he rewrote the story of the city, placing his reign at the center of continuity, as if to say that his hand maintained the link between heaven and earth. So much of authority in the ancient world depended on visible proof. A city wall could be photographed by hands as they hurled its bricks together, but a tower that soared above rooftops was an unmistakable claim. We are many, we are united, and we have the capacity to alter the very silhouette of the world. Builders understand rhetoric in stone, and the tower spoke in a language that needed no priestly explanation. It announced that Babylon would endure. The biblical description focuses on the human motive with surgical clarity. Let us make a name for ourselves, it says, as if the impulse to be remembered explains everything. That sentence compresses a complex social energy into a simple, almost universal confession. The desire for a name is not only a craving for fame, it is a reflex against the precariousness of life in a floodplain where famine, war, and disease could erase generations from the record overnight. But the story gives that motive an ominous twist by coupling it with the phrase, "lest we be scattered." There is, in that line, memory of catastrophe. Human memory in the ancient Near East never quite erased the flood story, the great wash that left a few survivors to restart the world. Building a tower, then, could be read as an attempt to fortify against cosmic repetition, a practical and symbolic bid for security. The tower was not just pride, it was a social insurance policy, an attempt to hold together a community against the tides of fate. When the narrative reaches the gods, it shifts from human communal intent to divine reaction. The deity in the story perceives the unified human endeavor as a threat. Not because height itself is threatening, but because unity without humility implies that humans might overreach. The gods, who depend on worship and proper order, react as guardians of the cosmic balance. Their intervention is swift, confounding language itself and scattering people across the earth. That confusion of tongues in the tale functions as an ideological device, explaining why the family of humanity divides into languages and cultures. It turns linguistic diversity into a moral lesson. Where once there was a single tongue and a single plan, there are now many voices and countless aims. The abruptness of the change evokes both wonder and sorrow, as if human unity had been a fragile miracle undone by its own momentum. To a listener, there is something heartbreakingly familiar about the fall from unity to fragmentation. Consider how often collective projects splinter when the center fails to hold or when ambition outpaces prudence. The Babel story contains a warning against hubris, but it also bears witness to a human tendency to strive together until the strain shows. Even that human truth is a kind of theology, a reflection on the limits of communal reach. Archaeology brings a different kind of voice, less interested in moral clarity and more in material continuities. Excavations at Babylon reveal layers upon layers of occupation, periods of rebuilding, and the repeated prominence of towering forms. Later kings, especially Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BCE, undertook vast construction projects that restored and sometimes radically altered older structures. These renovations are part of the living city, not an isolated act of vanity. Yet no extant structure precisely matches the manic scale imagined in the biblical tale. The Etemenenki's remains, to the extent they survive, are truncated and weathered, a stump of what once might have been more massive. Herodotus and other classical writers tell of enormous monuments in Babylon, and travelers through centuries reported awe-inspiring ruins. But time and warfare and the ravages of climate have simplified what we can now see. The mystery of the original shape feeds the myth rather than replacing it. Artists through the ages have taken the ambiguity and run with it. Painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder gave the tower a labyrinthine face, a spiraling behemoth with scaffolds and tiny human figures crawling like ants. That visual language accentuates the absurdity of human ambition and the comic futility of scale. But an artist can also bend sympathy toward the workers depicted, making the tower less a satire of grand will and more an elegy for those who believed in collective creation. Theological interpreters have read the tale in many registers. For some, it is a stern reminder that the boundary between human aspiration and divine prerogative must be respected. For others, it functions as an explanation of cultural multiplicity and the need for humility. Some modern theologians have reimagined the episode as a depiction of the dangers of centralized human power, an early critique of imperial monoliths. The story slips between meanings like light through dust, always revealing new glints. There is also a political dimension to the story that grows more visible when we consider Babylon as a hub of empire. Towers, walls, temples, and palaces were instruments of administrative discipline and propaganda. Constructing a monumental temple reinforced not only spiritual authority but also economic and bureaucratic networks. The laborers who built were, in many cases, conscripted or organized through systems of obligation. The tower thus became an axis where ideology, coercion, and faith intersected. Think of language as a technology in this context, not just a medium of speech. A single language can be a tool of governance, a means by which rules, taxes, and memories of debt are passed down. Fragmenting language is therefore destabilizing in a bureaucratic age. The story of Babel can be read as a caution about the infrastructural necessity of shared tongues and governance, and about the fragility of that necessity when human ambition challenges the repositories of power. Nevertheless, division brings its own creativity. When tongues divide, new literatures, arts, and mythologies arise. The world of languages is a garden of particularities, each with its idioms and metaphors that shape thought. From a later vantage, the scattering of humanity allows for cultural pluralism and cross-fertilization. What Genesis frames as a punishment can also be seen as an opening, a scattering of seeds that will root in different soils. The pattern of a tower reaching up and being thwarted can be found in other myths too. Across the ancient Near East, tales reflect anxieties about order and the limits of human reach. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, human achievement is tested by mortality and loss rather than divine bewilderment. Yet the motifs repeat: humans measure the world, make claims on it, and then encounter forces that either confirm their place or remind them of their bounds. The Babylonian account does not present divinity as petty in a modern caricature, but as invested in a balance that human unity had upset. The gods were custodians of order, and disorder was a cosmic risk. To ancient ears, this made sense because their understanding of causality linked ritual propriety to material prosperity. When rituals were neglected or misused, famine or plague might follow. When temples rose and rituals were performed, fortunes seemed to follow in predictable arcs. Our imagination of the tower can also be tactile. Picture the smell of sun-baked brick, the salt of sweat on lips, the chirp of birds in the stubble fields beyond the city, and the constant, low hum of conversation in a single tongue. Then imagine that chorus fragmenting into dozens of pitches as speech sputters and the common words abandon one another. The suddenness of silence and the cluster of new sounds would be disorienting and terrifying, as if the very map of mutual comprehension had been torn. Artists and poets have leaned into that sensory shock, turning Babel into a symbol of miscommunication that extends far beyond the ancient Near East. In modern fiction, Babel becomes shorthand for the perils of understanding, for the ways in which projects that aim at totality break down into ineradicable plurality. The tower is a metaphor for modern institutions too, multinational corporations, sprawling bureaucracies, networks that promise integration and deliver complexity. There is a tragic aspect to the story that appeals to our empathies. To be scattered means to lose neighbors, to lose a shared history, to have familiar gestures misread and friendly words misunderstood. Human communities often define themselves by the thin threads of shared speech and custom, and the cutting of those threads can feel, in narrative terms, like exile. That sense of loss is why the tale continues to resonate across centuries and continents. Yet the aftermath also invites renewal. Different languages create new metaphors that solve particular problems or generate unique music. The scattering of tongues fragments homogeneity but fosters innovation. New trade routes, new alliances, and new hybrid cultures can emerge when human groups disperse and recombine, and history records countless civilizations that grew from such exchange. Scholars of linguistics and anthropology have debated the literalness of the Babel myth. They point out that languages develop over long times through gradual divergence, not instantaneous divine intervention. But the myth operates on the level of meaning rather than chronology, capturing an existential truth about human strivings and their consequences. Myths do not aim to be scientific records, they are repositories of communal memory and ethical imagination. In the long sweep of history, Babylon itself became a symbol that every empire used and reinterpreted. Conquerors adopted Babylonian motifs to legitimize their rule, and refugees carried its stories into exile. Its memory traveled in clay tablets, in travelers' tales, and in the Bible. It became a mirror through which distant peoples inspected their own fears about pride and identity. The Tower of Babel thus migrated from a local claim to a universal image, reshaped by each voice that touched it. For medieval and Renaissance thinkers, Babel had allegorical uses. The tower became a device for moral sermons on pride and worldly ambition, and it provided artists with dramatic imagery for the vanity of human efforts. In the modern era, the motif reappears in debates about globalization, about whether a singular, homogenized culture is desirable or whether plurality should be celebrated. The story morphs to meet the anxieties of each age while retaining its core tension between unity and multiplicity. When we stand before ruins, whether physical or linguistic, we must ask what it is we mourn. Do we mourn the lost promise of unified understanding, or do we mourn the coercive unity that suppressed difference? The answer depends on which story of human community we prefer, one that prizes coherence at the cost of dissent, or one that values plurality even if it complicates governance. The Tower of Babel forces us to confront that choice in narrative form. Consider also the personal scale of the tale. Every life faces its own tower, an ambition that promises transformation but that risks rupturing relationships. Careers, political movements, artistic projects, each can bind people together and then tear them apart. The Babel story is therefore intimate as well as cosmic, a parable about the architecture of human desire and the delicate balances that sustain communities. Modern readers sometimes project onto the tower contemporary concerns about technological overreach. In an era of satellites, internet, and global networking, the idea of building toward some total knowledge has renewed resonance. The tower becomes a digital metaphor for systems that centralize language, data, and power, raising new ethical questions about control and the loss of small-scale autonomy. In that sense, Babel continues to be a useful lens for examining how networks both connect and fracture us. Yet not all confusion is punitive. Some modern philosophers and artists celebrate the creative potential of misunderstanding. Misreadings can be the birthplace of novel ideas, and multilingual settings can produce cognitive flexibility and inventive metaphors. Babel, in this reading, is less a punishment than an invitation to reinvent forms of relating, to find ways to communicate across difference rather than to long for an impossible past of undifferentiated unity. There is also a theological strain that resists simplistic condemnation of the divine act. Some traditions suggest that plurality is part of a divine plan for diversity, and that the scattering of languages was the first step toward a richer human tapestry. The diversity of tongues becomes a reflection of the divine imagination, a way for the sacred to be mediated through countless human voices. In that light, the story offers not merely a warning but a gift. The world is made more various and, perhaps, more beautiful. Archaeological fragments, clay tablets, and the ruins of foundations do not tell us which moral to take, but they do give us texture. The scratched lines of cuneiform, the pattern of administrative lists, and the remnants of cultic equipment place the stories in a human setting. People lived with these structures and told these tales to understand their world, to cope with the randomness of survival, and to frame their agency in relation to the gods they worshipped. The landscape of Babylon contributed to the drama. Endless plains allowed the tower to be visible from afar, making it a beacon and a target at once. The flatness of the land meant that height was immediately legible, to rise was to be unmistakable, to command attention from river and caravan alike. That visibility is part of why a tower mattered. It was both a spiritual ladder and a secular billboard announcing Babylon's centrality. When kings rebuilt temples, they often inscribed their achievements on stone and clay, leaving texts that read like manifestos. These inscriptions blended piety and propaganda, claiming divine favor while cementing practical authority. In those claims, the building of tall structures was also a claim to cultural immortality, an attempt to fix the narrative of rule into the city's very fabric. The tower sits at the intersection of faith and administration, of myth and monument. The psychological dimensions of building are worth noting. To work on a single massive project binds people together in shared rhythm. There is camaraderie in shared labor and a sense of identity in contributing to something larger than oneself. At the same time, such projects concentrate control and often produce inequalities, as those who command resources and those who supply the muscle relate in asymmetrical ways. Thus, the tower is a social crucible where solidarity and power imbalance cohabit. Even the language of the original texts suggests unease with mastery. The biblical tale frames the gods' reaction as a corrective to human presumptuousness, implying that the project was too much in a moral sense. Yet other ancient authors view such projects with admiration for technical skill and organizational capacity. That ambivalence reflects broader human ambivalence. We admire the heights our ancestors reached even as we recognize the costs involved. The scent of incense and the crackle of ritual fires would have accompanied ceremonies on such a ziggurat. Priests performed rituals intended to keep the cosmos aligned, to feed the gods through offerings and supplication. Those rituals created a rhythm that justified the tower's presence. They knitted the material and the sacred together in daily practice. For many people, the tower was therefore not hubris but piety, a site where the city met its gods and kept its promises. And yet, narratives of divine retribution resonate because humans often interpret failures as signs of moral lapse. The sudden dispersion of language in the tale reads like a judgment that reinserts humility into social terms. Judgment stories serve communities by offering explanations for misfortune and by framing obedience as a virtue. Whether one treats such stories as literal history or symbolic teaching, they perform social work as much as they narrate events. Over time, Babylon's symbolic life extended beyond the Near East. In Western literature, Babel became shorthand for the problem of overreaching. In other cultures, it served as a mirror for local anxieties about centralization. The tower became portable in thought, a trope to use whenever the clash between unity and diversity had to be dramatized. As the story traveled, it accrued new layers of meaning and absorbed new cultural inflections. One can also see the tower as an architectural metaphor for language itself, a structure built one brick at a time, dependent on communal practice and shared rules. Languages grow by accretion, and speakers add to them, borrow from one another, and create new grammatical scaffolds. The confusion of tongues in the myth thus functions as a poetic reversal of linguistic construction. Instead of accreting together, languages split apart, each pursuing its own morphological logic. In modern scholarship, debates about the historical Edom and Enki and the Tower of Genesis continue. Some scholars emphasize colonial or imperial readings, suggesting that the narrative of downfall functions to critique imperial overreach. Others highlight the story's ritual dimensions or its role in folk memory of real architectural projects. Each interpretation opens a different window on the interplay between text, memory, and material culture. There is, too, a personal resonance when one contemplates the tower alone by moonlight. The silhouette of a stepped mound against stars invites inward thought, a weighing of ambition and its costs. In the hush of night, the very idea of a human structure meeting heaven seems both glorious and impossible, a testament to hope and a reminder of limit. The tower is thus a point of inward and outward reflection, a catalyst for both communal myth and solitary meditation. The lesson that a listener might carry away depends on what one is willing to value. If one values cohesion above all, the story warns of the dangers of unchecked ambition. If one values pluralism, the story can be read as an origin tale for the richness of human culture. Both readings live in tension, and perhaps the tale's endurance stems from its ability to sustain that tension and to return listeners to it again and again. In contemporary life, we can hear the echoes of Babel and the cacophony of voices on the internet, where languages mingle and sometimes misfire. Digital platforms promise a universal reach but frequently result in fragmented publics and echo chambers. The modern tower is intangible, built of code and connection rather than mud bricks, but the same dilemmas arise: how to balance unity with difference, and how to create structures that uplift without crushing variety. The Tower of Babel, then, is less an ancient relic than a living symbol. It stands as an emblem of the human condition, of our ability to craft structures of meaning and of our propensity to collide with limits. Whether viewed as a warning, an explanation, or a creative origin story, it keeps speaking across millennia, reminding us that our highest edifices are always drafted in the margins between aspiration and restraint. History continues its slow dialogue with myth. Archaeologists unearth fragments, linguists parse inscriptions, and theologians interpret texts, each adding a syllable to a conversation that began when people first told stories about why their tongues had become many. The tower remains a node in that conversation, a focal point where material evidence and narrative imagination converge to ask what it is to be human. If we return, finally, to the plain where the tower rose, we can reimagine the city as a place of interwoven lives: bakers, scribes, priests, sailors on the Euphrates, and children who chased one another in alleys. The tower's shadow fell across all of them, and whether it was instrument of unity or a spur to dispersion, it was part of the city's breath. To listen to the story from that human scale is to hear both the hum of daily life and the loud, uncanny aspiration that made people reach toward the sky. Thus the tale of Babel remains both particular and universal. It is particular in its setting, stocked with the smells and labor of ancient Babylon, and it is universal in its themes of ambition, community, and the limits of reach. The story continues to gather meaning as people retell and reimagine it, and in that continuing it becomes not a closed parable but a living conversation about who we are and what we might become. Imagine a city that rises from the plain like a promise, where the dust of the desert meets the sweep of human ambition and the sky seems to bend toward stone and water. That was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, a place where walls became poetry and gardens tried to hold back the sun. As you listen, picture the first light painting gold on baked brick, and a ruler who believed that glory could be measured in building and conquest, and in the ordering of a city so splendid that travelers would speak of it for millennia. Nebuchadnezzar himself fills the foreground of this scene like an imposing portrait. He was a man who wore victory like armor and architecture like a crown, who left inscriptions boasting of his deeds and who ordered gardens into the air to please a queen or perhaps to challenge the very idea of natural order. He came to power in an age where kings were judged by their capacity to rebuild, to enlarge, and to make offerings both to gods and to their own names. His reign was not just a period on a calendar but a long act of shaping memory. To understand his city, you must first understand its setting, the wide flat plain between the Euphrates and the Tigris, where the rivers braid and give life to fields and the occasional reed. Babylon grew where water fed civilization and where rulers could command irrigation with the same authority they exerted over armies. The plain itself whispered of fertility and vulnerability, where the pulse of commerce and the threat of invasion beat in the same rhythm. And Nebuchadnezzar's vision was to turn that vulnerability into a spectacle of control. The walls of Babylon were the first sentence of Nebuchadnezzar's story, tall, thick, and mythic in proportion. Travelers later wrote that the walls could have held a chariot on top of them and that their circumference was so vast a month's march might not have been enough to trace them all. These were not mere fortifications. They were declarations that the city was a city of cities, a place where safety, order, and imperial pride met in sun-baked clay and fired brick. When you imagine those walls, imagine labor and logistics in a world without cranes. Imagine a city building itself with thousands of hands. Within the embrace of those walls, the city glittered with avenues and public spaces that echoed with commerce and politics, where merchants from distant lands negotiated over textiles and spices, and scribes counted shipments with reed styluses on clay tablets. The sound of commerce, voices, animals, the scrape of pottery, filled the streets, and the river provided both water and a route for goods to move in from the east and west. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a hub where local grain met imported timber, where the money economy and tribute from provinces kept the city fed and the king's workshops busy. There was an energy there like a constant, low drumbeat, relentless and purposeful. If the walls were Nebuchadnezzar's outer show, then the Ishtar Gate was his appointed entrance to wonder. Adorned with brilliantly glazed bricks in cobalt blues and decorated with alternating rows of lions, bulls, and dragons, it was not only a gateway but a theatrical statement. Walking through it would have been like stepping into the mind of a king who wanted visitors to understand immediately that divine favor and royal might were woven together here. At night, lanterns would have cast a warm glow over the tiles, and the figures of mythical creatures would shift between shadow and color, making the stone seem to breathe. The processional way that led from the gate deeper into the city was designed for formal parades and religious ceremonies, for the slow pacing of priests and the high steps of gods carried on litters. On festival days, the avenue filled with color, with the scent of incense and the sound of drums, and the king would parade captured riches and tribute as proof of dominion. Nebuchadnezzar understood how spectacle could make abstract power tangible and how a city's architecture could instruct, intimidate, and inspire in equal measure. The civic space itself became a stage on which the state performed its power. But any story of Babylon must turn to water, because water was the secret in the king's triumphs and the source of the city's seeming miracles. Irrigation channels ran like veins through the plain, and Nebuchadnezzar improved and expanded those channels, ordering canals dug, levees raised, and dikes reinforced. Water management was at once engineering, administration, and a kind of ritual. It required coordination of labor, careful timing with the seasons, and the maintenance of a bureaucracy to keep records and settle disputes. Without this control of water, the gardens, the fields, and indeed the city itself would have been vulnerable to chaos. From water came the idea of the hanging gardens, a story that haunts imaginations because it sounds like the most human kind of luxury, trees planted on terraces like islands of refuge above the ground. Whether or not the gardens were exactly as ancient writers described, they represented a larger truth about Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions to reshape the landscape and to create a piece of paradise in the midst of dust and heat. The engineering required, lifting water to upper terraces, finding soil deep enough for roots, preventing collapse, would have been extraordinary even by later standards, and the very thought of it testifies to the king's appetite for monumentality. The gardens, real or symbolic, also told a story of empire and marriage, for ancient accounts suggest Nebuchadnezzar built them to please a homesick queen from a distant land who longed for mountains and greenery. In that narrative, the king becomes not only a conqueror but a lover, one who translates political power into a private tenderness that is architectural rather than poetic. Yet even this tenderness carried political meaning, for it demonstrated that the king could command nature itself to serve human desires. The gardens, then, were at once pleasure and propaganda, a private refuge that broadcast public potency. Nebuchadnezzar's conquests fed whatever feeding frenzy ambition sets loose. He campaigned across the Near East, moving from city to city in a driven attempt to secure borders and exact tribute. The details of his military life, banners raised, chariot wheels flashing, lines of soldiers marching under hot suns, were the logistical counterpart to his building campaigns. Victory fed building, and building reinforced victory. Every new road or canal facilitated another campaign and helped sustain the administrative control of far-flung territories. His siegecraft and diplomatic maneuvering reshaped the political map of the region, toppling some powers and absorbing others. Cities that resisted were punished, their walls torn down and their elites replaced with loyal administrators. Others surrendered and were folded into an empire that leveraged local structures to rule efficiently. Nebuchadnezzar's brand of governance was not mere bloody conquest. It included installation of governors, establishment of tribute systems, and the distribution of spoils that fueled both palace and temple economies. Yet conquest also carried burdens, managing diverse peoples, ensuring adequate harvests, and preventing rebellion required a network of officials and the steady collection of taxes. The king relied on an army that could be called up for campaigns, but he also needed scribes who could write up decrees, record receipts, and administer justice. Thus Babylon's bureaucracy became as important as its battalions, and clay tablets, many now broken, recorded transactions and orders that kept the imperial engine turning. Nebuchadnezzar's greatness was partly an understanding that war fought without administration could not, in the long run, produce lasting empire. Inside the royal palace, life mixed ceremony and calculation. The palace itself was a place of rooms for audiences, treasuries filled with tribute, and workshops where artisans turned raw materials into objects of beauty. Gold was hammered and inlaid, lapis lazuli imported from distant mines gleamed in jewelry, and artisans carved reliefs and statues that immortalized gods and rulers alike. The palace was a microcosm of the city's capacity to command resources and labor, a place where the king's image was literally cast in metal and adorning stone. Religion in Babylon was never far from politics because the gods were understood to be the sources and legitimizers of power. Marduk emerged as the chief deity in Babylonian consciousness, a god whose favor kings sought through building temples and offering sacrifices. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions often claim that he rebuilt or restored temples and made offerings to the gods, a kind of pious rhetoric designed to show devotion and to bind the divine to the monarchy. Rituals and festivals punctuated the year and gave rhythm to civic life, tying religious calendar to agricultural seasons and imperial narratives. Scribes and priests sat at the intersection of devotion and governance, preserving knowledge and performing rituals that sustained both the spiritual and administrative life of the city. They taught in scribal schools, inscribed myths and laws on clay, and calculated astronomical events that informed calendrical decisions. Their writings give us much of what we know about the era: lists of kings, accounts of building projects, and legal records that reveal the workings of a society invested in order. The act of writing in Babylon was both practical and sacred, an enterprise that preserved memory and mediated authority. Architecture was a form of storytelling in Babylon, and every facade, gate, and stele narrated a chapter of the city's identity. Decorative reliefs portrayed gods, mythic beasts, and scenes of tribute, translating theology into a visual rhetoric that communicated to populace and visitor alike. Brick inscriptions, some boasting Nebuchadnezzar's name and accomplishments, were placed where passers-by could read or see them, reinforcing a narrative of righteous rule and divine favor. Architecture thus functioned as a public book, and the city was its library. The economy that sustained such grand projects was complex and surprisingly modern in its features, with marketplaces, workshops, and financial instruments that facilitated trade. Merchants negotiated prices, loans were made with collateral, and long-distance trade connected Babylonian workshops to sources of timber, metals, and precious stones. Grain flows mattered enormously. Control of harvestable land and the ability to store and distribute grain could mean the difference between stability and famine. Nebuchadnezzar's projects therefore rested on economic foundations that were carefully managed and sometimes precarious. Artisans were the invisible legions of Babylon's splendor, their hands shaping the raw things of the earth into objects of beauty and function. Potters spun clay into jars that held oil and grain, metalworkers forged weapons and ceremonial items, and weavers produced textiles that travelers sought out. These skilled workers operated in workshops attached to neighborhoods or to the palace itself, and their lives were defined by rhythms of craft, heat, repetition, meticulous attention to detail. They turned the empire's resources into a tangible reality. The city's neighborhoods were vibrant and heterogeneous, each quarter with its own markets, temples, and public spaces where daily life unfolded in countless small dramas. Children played in streets that smelled of baking bread and wet clay, wives negotiated the distribution of household goods, and elders recalled seasons of droughts and floods. Amid the grandeur of palace and gate, ordinary life continued with a human intimacy, births, marriages, disagreements, and the slow passing of generations. Nebuchadnezzar's great projects did not exist in a vacuum. They were part of a living city pulsing with human stories. Craftsmen and merchants lived alongside scribes and priests, and the interactions among these groups produced cultural vibrancy. Festivals brought them together in shared rituals, while trade networks extended familial ties across distances. Music and poetry accompanied religious observance and private celebrations, and artisans designed instruments to be both functional and beautiful. This cultural life made Babylon not only a center of power but a place that attracted talent and imagination. Nebuchadnezzar's building campaigns were not only about outward glory but about the consolidation of memory. His name appears on bricks and plaques throughout the city because he wanted future generations to know who had ordered the gates and who had filled the temple treasuries. Yet this act of inscription also speaks to an awareness of mortality. Rulers build to be remembered, to inscribe their names in the durable materials of stone and fired clay. In that sense, Nebuchadnezzar was like all men who attempt to arrest time by changing the landscape. Beyond the city walls, rural communities bore the consequences of imperial policy, sometimes flourishing under improved irrigation and at other times suffering from heavy taxation or forced labor. Peasants worked the fields that fed Babylon, and their lives were bound to the success of agricultural systems the state maintained. When the irrigation worked and canals were clean, harvests could be plentiful. When maintenance lagged, drought or salinization could make land less productive. The rural-urban relationship was therefore a fragile contract dependent on infrastructure and governance. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions read like official testimonies where he recounts building temples, restoring canals, and subduing rebellious cities, often in a tone that blends piety and pride. These inscriptions served propagandistic purposes, but they also functioned as records of the king's activities in an age when few other documents might survive. They were carefully framed to place the king within a narrative of divine favor, claiming that he built not for pride alone but as an instrument of the will of the gods. For modern historians, these stones are essential primary sources, though they must be read with an awareness of their rhetorical aims. If we look at Nebuchadnezzar's style of rulership, it is clear he balanced force with monumental show, combining military action with artistic patronage. This approach made Babylon seem both invincible and cultured, a civilization that could dominate rivals and also create works of beauty. The king's personality emerges in fragments, ambitious, religiously engaged, sometimes ruthless, yet his actions form a coherent strategy to elevate Babylon into a capital worthy of divine kingship. He wanted a city that could speak for his reign in stone and water. The Jewish Bible casts Nebuchadnezzar in a complex light, especially in relation to the exile of the Judeans and the destruction of Jerusalem. In those narratives, he is both the instrument of divine judgment and a proud ruler who sets up an image for worship, a man of ambivalence who experiences humbling visions. These stories have colored centuries of interpretation and have often shaped Western memory of the king more than archaeological detail. Yet whether viewed through biblical pages or excavated bricks, Nebuchadnezzar remains a figure who looms large in cultural imagination. Archaeology in Babylon has revealed fragments that both confirm and complicate the ancient texts, with layers of pottery, foundations of grand structures, and remnants of fortifications surfacing under modern digs. Excavations have found inscriptions bearing Nebuchadnezzar's name, remnants of the Ishtar Gate, and clues about the urban grid. Each find is a conversation across time, where we attempt to piece together daily life, ritual activity, and the scale of building projects from the physical evidence. Such work is painstaking, but it steadily shifts what we know from myth into grounded history. The fall of Babylon centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's reign was as dramatic as its rise, and it came to be a cautionary tale about the transience of human achievement. Conquered and reconfigured by later powers, the city's fortunes rose and fell with empires. Yet even in ruin its stones carried stories, and those stories informed later rulers who sought to claim Babylon's legacy for themselves. The city's arc from dazzling capital to archaeological site speaks to the fragility and endurance of human endeavor alike. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy influenced successors and rivals who borrowed architectural forms and symbolic gestures, attempting to replicate the feel of Babylonian might. The language of royal inscription, the grandeur of processional ways, and the emphasis on monumental gates were templates used elsewhere in Mesopotamia. Even the idea of a king who fused piety with public works lived on as a model of rulership, a template for future monarchs who wished to be remembered as both devout and powerful. Babylon, in this way, became a cultural prototype. We should not forget the artisans who glazed the Ishtar Gates bricks in vivid blues and greens, their techniques lost and recovered through trial and error by modern restorers. The glazing process required fine control of firing temperatures and chemical knowledge of pigments, a blend of craft and chemistry that betrays a sophisticated technological culture. Those bricks are more than decorative elements, they are evidence of scientific practice and aesthetic judgment. When we stand before the gates fragments in museums today, we see the imprint of those hands across millennia. The gardens, whether literally hanging or conceptually elevated, became a symbol that crossed cultures and centuries, inspiring poets, travelers, and emperors. Stories of Babylon's greenery seemed to contradict the reality of the surrounding arid plains and so gained a mythical quality that made them irresistible. The image of terraces planted with trees and dripping with vines persisted in the Western imagination as a kind of archetype of luxury and human triumph over climate. Even if historical accuracy remains debated, the idea of the gardens has its own cultural life. Every city requires roads, and Babylon's arteries facilitated movement of grain, troops, and information, knitting together the urban fabric. These roads were lined with shops, way stations, and sometimes with reliefs that reminded travelers of the state's presence. Movement across the city was tied to economic cycles, market days, times for tax levies, and seasonal festivals that pulled the populace into public life. Nebuchadnezzar's investment in infrastructure was not only aesthetic, it was a practical means of consolidating control. Babylonian law and order were expressed through legal codes, local courts, and royal decrees that settled disputes and administered penalties. The law functioned to stabilize commerce and to protect royal assets, from temple property to palace stores. Trials could be public affairs, and the king's word often stood as the final arbiter, a reminder that law in Babylon was embedded in both social custom and royal authority. The legal system thus reinforced a social hierarchy that kept commerce flowing and civil life predictable. Festivals in Babylon were moments of communal identity, tying the city together across social strata. During rituals like the New Year festival, the king might undergo symbolic humiliation to reaffirm cosmic order, a dramatic act where roles were inverted briefly to restore balance. Such ceremonies were theater with theological import, designed to reassure citizens that the gods remained propitious and the world maintained equilibrium. Nebuchadnezzar's participation in these rituals linked him visibly to divine order and to the people he ruled. Language and literature flourished in Babylon, with myths, epics, and ritual texts circulating among trained scribes and intellectuals. Stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh lived in the cultural background and shaped ideas of heroism and mortality. Scholars studied omens and astronomical phenomena, hoping to interpret the gods' will, and their findings influenced royal decisions and public anxieties alike. This intellectual life gave the city a depth beyond architecture, a civilization that reflected on fate, gods, and the human condition. Trade routes connected Babylon to distant lands where raw materials came from places many months away by caravan or river. Timber arrived from forests far to the north or west, bitumen and metals from other regions, and precious stones from still farther afield. These networks were arteries sustaining the city's taste for luxury and practical need, and they testified to a cosmopolitan openness that both enriched and complicated governance. The king relied on such connections to build palaces and to maintain prestige, and merchants navigated them at risk and reward. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions and the archaeological evidence suggest a ruler who was deeply conscious of legacy, using every medium at his disposal to carve a place for himself in history. He rebuilt temples, raised walls, and inscribed his name on bricks because he wanted to be remembered as a benefactor of gods and men. That desire reflects a universal human need to leave a trace, to make mortality meet something more permanent. The city, in turn, became the vessel for that meeting. The city's crafts extended to daily comforts as well as ceremonial splendor, producing household items, cooking ware, and tools that made domestic life possible. These very ordinary objects reveal much about eating habits, hygiene, and family life, showing us the human scale beneath monumental works. A woman's spindle, a potter's kiln, these are as vital to understanding Babylon as any gate or palace. They tell us how people lived, loved, and labored between the events that earn a king his reputation. The human cost of Nebuchadnezzar's projects sometimes remains invisible in grandeur's shadow. Laborers worked long hours, often under coercion or obligation, and the maintenance of an empire demanded human resources diverted from other communal needs. While the archaeological record can show tools and housing, it cannot always tell us the full dimensions of social strain. Yet the stories that survive hint at a complex society where public glory was purchased with private sacrifices. This tension between splendor and strain is a recurring theme in the histories of powerful cities. Language, too, served as a tool of empire, with Akkadian and other tongues used to administer diverse populations. Scribal schools taught not only how to write but how to speak the language of power, and those trained in cuneiform could ascend to positions of influence. Language shaped identity, law, and ritual, enabling Babylon to operate as an intellectual and administrative center. The spread of language paralleled the spread of other cultural forms, creating a recognizable Babylonian imprint across the region. Nebuchadnezzar's use of art and symbolism was a political project, a way of inscribing a narrative of right rule into the visible landscape of the city. Lions on the Ishtar Gate spoke of royal courage, dragons hinted at divine protection, the king's name on bricks declared ownership not only of the city's stones but of its destiny. Art served as a language without words, reaching those who could not read and communicating a shared set of values and fears. Through art, the king cultivated an image that would outlive his body. The city's markets were places where social classes intersected, where the poor and the wealthy could cross paths, and where the pulse of demand shaped production. Sellers displayed their wares, from fish and barley to woven cloth and metalwork, and negotiating a price involved skill and temperament. Markets were noisy and lively, but they were also regulatory spaces where standards and weights mattered for the integrity of trade. Nebuchadnezzar relied on markets to feed the city and to collect revenue, making them crucial to urban health. Babylon's craftspeople also engaged in scientific practices, refining alloys, experimenting with glazes, and understanding hydraulics well enough to maintain canals and perhaps ambitious gardens. This applied knowledge was not a separate intellectual elite but embedded in workshops and temple complexes, where practical needs demanded reliable techniques. The successful application of these technologies allowed monumental projects to exist, from strong walls to luxuriant terraces. When we admire the city's beauty, we trace it back to a foundation of problem-solving and skill. Beyond the physical city, Babylon operated as a mythic symbol, a place invoked by poets, conquerors, and religious thinkers across ages, sometimes as a foil for moral tales and sometimes as an exemplar of civilization. Its image became layered, on the one hand a seat of culture and learning, on the other an emblem of hubris and decadence. This duality kept Babylon alive in literature and art long after its bricks fell quiet. Nebuchadnezzar's era contributed importantly to that layered symbolism. The palace archives, where they have survived, contain administrative tablets that show detailed accounts of rations, workforce assignments, and the procurement of raw materials. These mundane records are the scaffolding behind grand narratives, proof that empire relied on meticulous planning as much as on daring. Tablets recording grain allocations for workers or the distribution of textiles reveal the day-to-day realities of running a capital. They remind us that behind every monument is a ledger of work performed and resources expended. Nebuchadnezzar's building style balanced durability with visual drama, producing monuments that were meant to endure and to impress. Brick and bitumen, carefully layered and often glazed, created faces for structures that could withstand the elements and still present the king's intended narrative. That combination of practicality and showmanship reflected a broader cultural preference for works that were both useful and symbolic. The city's physical resilience was therefore both engineering and propaganda. Foreigners who visited Babylon centuries later often wrote of its splendor with a mix of admiration and incredulity, attesting to the city's continuing aura even after its political power waned. To them, Babylon was a tale told in stone, a place where the past seemed tangible and where the remnants of grandeur inspired reflection. Their accounts differ in detail but converge in a sense of awe, a testament to Nebuchadnezzar's lasting impact on landscape and imagination. Legal documents also record how property disputes and commercial litigation unfolded, offering a window into civic life and the enforcement of norms. Judges and provincial officials adjudicated matters with a combination of written law and established practice, aiming to keep commercial life predictable. Sometimes punishment was public to deter misconduct, sometimes settlement involved restitution or fines. These legal practices reveal a society attempting to regulate complex interactions among its people. The king's inscriptions also emphasize restoration and repair, suggesting that maintaining grandeur was as vital as creating it. Nebuchadnezzar speaks of repairing dilapidated temples and walls, a rhetoric that framed his work as service to both gods and people. This language of repair resonates because it shows a ruler who saw himself as steward of tradition, not merely as an innovator. It is a reminder that empires are built not only by novelty but by the continued maintenance of what previous generations left. Music and theater likely accompanied religious festivals and palace events, creating experiences that intertwined narrative, sound, and ceremonial gesture. Musicians played lyres and flutes while singers intoned myths that connected ordinary folks to cosmic stories. These performances were communal, producing emotions that reinforced social cohesion and religious devotion alike. The sensory life of Babylon, sight, smell, sound, made the city an immersive environment. Among Nebuchadnezzar's many projects, aqueducts and canals stand out as feats that combined necessity with grandeur, channeling water where it was most needed and supporting agricultural expansion. These works required detailed planning and ongoing labor to clear silt and maintain banks, but they transformed the environment, expanding arable land and supporting urban growth. The ability to direct water also translated to political power, because control over irrigation meant control over food and therefore over people. Education, for those who could access it, opened pathways into bureaucratic and priestly ranks, and learning to read cuneiform was a skill that conferred status. Schools attached to temples taught mathematics, astronomy, and divination, preparing students to serve in administrative capacities or interpret omens for leaders. Education thus became a mechanism for social mobility and for the transmission of cultural norms. Nebuchadnezzar's city needed such trained minds to keep the empire running. The myth-making around Nebuchadnezzar continued long after his death, filtered through the lenses of different cultures and later empires that repurposed Babylonian symbols for their own ends. Roman, Persian, and Greek writers referenced Babylon as a kind of historical shorthand for a civilization of immense antiquity and achievement. Each retelling altered details, But the essence persisted. Babylon remained a byword for a city that combined beauty, wealth, and ominous power. Nebuchadnezzar's projects played a central role in creating that lasting image. In the archaeological record, layers upon layers of occupation reveal changes in style, function, and population, showing how Babylon was never static but rather a living tapestry woven over centuries. Stratigraphy tells us when walls were repaired, when floors were replaced, and when certain crafts flourished or dwindled. These strata are the city's memory, recording cycles of prosperity and decline. To read them is to understand Babylon as a continuous experiment in urban life. Nebuchadnezzar's commitment to monumental construction also had economic ripple effects, creating demand for materials, labor, and expertise that fueled other sectors of the economy. Stonecutters, brickmakers, transporters, and merchants all benefited from the frequent need for supplies and workmanship. Public works thus shaped private livelihoods, connecting the king's vision to the daily survival and prosperity of thousands. The economic web around building projects made such undertakings politically sensible as well as symbolically effective. Religion and kingship in Babylon formed a constant dialogue, where rulers sought to show deference to gods while also using religious language to justify policies and assert authority. Temples were not only sacred spaces but also banks and administrative centers that stored wealth and food. This overlap made the interface between temple and palace both cooperative and competitive at times, with priests and kings negotiating power through ritual, construction, and fiscal control. Nebuchadnezzar's reign exemplifies this entwined relationship. Even as centuries passed and conquerors came to call Babylon other names or to repurpose its stones, the idea of the Golden City endured as an archetype. Writers painted it in words, travelers tried to reconcile myth with ruins, and empires leaned on its prestige to bolster their own claims. Nebuchadnezzar's influence, therefore, was not only material but symbolic. He helped craft a memory that would echo through history, shaping how civilizations defined grandeur and power. When you stand before fragments of the Ishtar Gate in a museum or read Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, you are participating in a long conversation about ambition, devotion, and the desire to make permanence out of human life. The city he built was a stage where kings and priests, artisans and merchants, engaged in acts of creation and maintenance that defined an era. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a human achievement of staggering complexity, a place where the needs of survival met the hunger for beauty. Even the city's decline tells us something about the limits of power. No wall, however tall, could halt the erosion of time and the sweep of changing political fortunes. Yet those same ruins teach resilience, because the memory of Babylon and the traces left in brick and tablet continue to inform our understanding of ancient achievement. Nebuchadnezzar's glory, then, is double-edged. It is both a testament to human will and a reminder of temporal fragility. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon invites contemplation about how civilizations shape the world and are in turn shaped by it, how rulers attempt to enshrine themselves in stone and narrative, and how ordinary lives are woven into epic projects. The city stands as an example of the human capacity to combine engineering, art, religion, and governance into a singular, enduring expression. As you continue about your day, carry this vision of Babylon with you, the gardens that might have floated above terraces, the gate that thrilled with blue, the walls that spoke of certainty, and the ruler who sought to turn memory into monument. There is a sound to the fall of an empire if you listen close enough, not a single trumpet blast but a layered, patient chorus, the murmurs of discontent, the creak of alliances shifting, the whisper of prophets naming a future that seems to come from some other place. Babylon had such a sound, the echo of its own grandeur and of those who saw that grandeur is fragile. In the dusk before the city would change hands forever, the towers and walls threw long shadows across the Euphrates, and those shadows carried rumors as easily as dust. Imagine the city at its height, broad avenues, bright glazed bricks shimmering in the sun, the Ishtar Gates blues like a sudden piece of the seed planted inland. Merchants walked under columns carved with lions and dragons. Priests swept the courtyards and spoke names of gods that shaped the law and the calendar. People traded in silver and grain, in silk and secrets, and the river cut a living vein through the heart of everything, keeping the city fed, cooled, and connected to the world beyond its walls. And yet Babel's facade masked fractures. Many of those fractures were political, some religious, several cultural, and a few personal. A king could rule through ceremony and bronze, but the king who misread the mood of his priests or the needs of his military could find his throne eroding like mortar under rain. When a state depends on layers, citizen, soldier, scribe, priest, foreigner, then cracks in one layer send tremors through the whole. Prophecy is a strange companion to conquest, partly because it speaks in a language that can calm and terrify at once. Prophets in the years before Babylon's fall did not talk solely of military defeat. They spoke of divine judgment, of ritual failings, of moral collapse, and the consequences of hubris. To a people who saw gods as active players in the world, such words carried weight equivalent to an approaching army, and their timing mattered as much as any battering ram. Isaiah and Jeremiah are the names most familiar to readers, and their verses hang over the ruin like banners. Isaiah's imagery moves in sudden sweeps, declaring that the proud will be humbled and the city turned into a haunt for wild beasts. Jeremiah took a voice at once more intimate and more devastating, telling of mothers weeping in the streets and the splendor of palaces reduced to heaps. To an audience then and now, those speeches were not metaphors but warnings given in the belief that the fate of a city could be foretold and, in some sense, altered. Daniel, too, looms in the later imagination because of the courtly drama associated with Babylon's elite. His visions read like the politics of power given shape, beasts and empires rising and falling, a divine clock that ticks through monarchies. The biblical stories latch prophecy and power together, suggesting that the fall was both a historical event and a fulfillment of cosmic patterns, and that understanding it required reading both bronze and scripture. But prophecy did not operate alone. It walked beside discontent and whispered into the ears of those who had practical grievances. Nabonidus, the last king before the fall, had complicated the relationship between throne and temple. He was a rare figure who preferred archaeology and devotions at distant shrines to the clerical life at Babylon's heart, and his absence from the spiritual center opened him to charges of neglect or worse from the city's religious class. Nabonidus's son, often called Belshazzar in the biblical memory, acted as a regent and a party host in the city. That image, of a young regent presiding over banquets while the empire trembled, became emblematic and almost theatrical in later retellings. Whether or not Belshazzar's feasts were as infamous as they were painted, the story encapsulates a deeper point. When a ruler's attention turns toward display and revelry, public confidence falters and enemies of the regime find fertile ground. Betrayal, in the end, is never certain until it happens, but it germinates where trust has weakened. The court of Babylon, like any large court, contained factions. Some favored traditional priestly power, others wanted the military to rule, others saw advantage in aligning with foreign powers or ambitious generals. In a city that thrived on the interplay of mercantile, sacramental, and military interests, the wrong tension could pull at more than a single thread. Stories of betrayal that surround Babylon's fall range from whispered claims of inside help to elaborate accounts of bribery and broken oaths. Herodotus tells of a Babylonian gatekeeper who accepted a bribe and opened a gate for a Persian soldier, a story simple enough to make sense and satisfying in its moral clarity. Later sources add subtle shades. Some speak of nobles disillusioned with their king, others of priests who saw their office better preserved under a new rule. The details differ, But the theme remains: someone on the inside eased the way for those outside. If we step from anecdote to strategy, Cyrus the Great's conquest shows a combination of timing, cunning, and opportunism. He was not merely a conqueror of armies but a builder of allegiances, a man who understood both Persian might and Median networks and used them to stitch together a broader coalition. He also brought a political offer that made surrender more appealing than slaughter. In many cities he took, he allowed local customs and religious practices to persist, and that policy softened resistance. Cyrus's methods are chronicled in different tones depending on the source. The Cyrus Cylinder praises him as a liberating ruler who restored temples and returned statues to their sacred houses. That record is propaganda mixed with policy, yet it reveals a deliberate approach: conquer quickly, legitimize your rule by appearing pious and restorative, and bind local elites to you by respecting what they held holy. In Babylon, where religion underpinned civic identity, such gestures mattered immensely. Herodotus and other classical writers add color in their own ways, telling of a night assault where low waters and a diverted river gave Persian troops a way into the city. According to his telling, soldiers entered through the riverbed beneath the walls, passing where once only fish and reeds had been, and found a gate left unguarded. Whether precisely true or embroidered, the story emphasizes surprise and the way ordinary terrain can become a route of conquest when men in high places stop watching. Archaeological and cuneiform sources, meanwhile, give us fragments of a more bureaucratic reality. Nabonidus's prolonged absence from Babylon, he spent years in Tama in the Arabian desert, left administrative space that could be filled by his son and by local powers. The priestly class of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, resented Nabonidus's neglect and his apparent favoring of other cults, and that resentment matters because priests commanded resources, influence, and public ritual that legitimized the state. The idea that shekels and sacraments could change the course of siege is not merely romantic. Priesthoods could call upon the populace with a language of divine anger, and a city whose rituals had been neglected could find its people unbound to defend a regime that seemed to ignore the gods. When the temple rituals stop or are reduced, the smoke that lifts to heaven is dimmed, and the city's connection to its gods feels compromised. In a society where gods and royal power were intertwined, that sense was fatal in slow motion. One can imagine nights in Babylon where priests debated whether to bless the king or to whisper in private that his removal might restore the divine favor that had been lost. Those debates are not recorded in full. What remains are the traces, letters, lists, and the tones of later chroniclers. Yet the outline is clear. Religion could be a shield for the city or a wedge within it, and when it turned inward, it undermined civic unity. Across the Euphrates, Cyrus built momentum by promising both clemency and stability. To subjects who had known hoplite slaughter and capricious rule, the idea of a ruler who would restore temples and repatriate idols sounded like an oracle made practical. His forces were disciplined, and his leadership cultivated loyalty among officers whose status might improve under a durable imperial system that also respected local customs. When armies approach a city like Babylon, the shape of defense is not only about walls and weapons but about memory and ritual. Citizens believed the walls had stood since time immemorial. Priests performed daily rites that implied a cosmic order. The king's presence at ceremonies made the city's protection feel absolute. To break such a city required not only soldiers at the gate but a change in belief, either that the gods had abandoned the place or that a new order promised continuity without them. Thus the fall of Babylon was, in part, a collapse of faith in the existing guarantees. It was easier for soldiers to enter a gate that fewer people guarded, and easier still if the guard's loyalty had shifted. The story of a gatekeeper opening a portal to the enemy is a powerful symbol, but it points to a deeper reality: that people's loyalties are conditional and that empires survive only so long as they command those loyalties. The writing on the wall tale crystallizes these dynamics into a dramatic scene. In a banquet hall, amid wine and music, a hand writes a message no scribe can erase, and the king's face turns pale because he recognizes not simply a threat but the fulfillment of a long-standing divine verdict. Belshazzar's reaction is less historian's detail than moral parable, but it captures how sudden recognition of doom can arrive in the midst of revelry and how leaders can find words and ceremonies insufficient against the destiny perceived. We should remember, though, that history is not only parable. Cuneiform tablets record orders, economic exchanges, and military dispositions that map the city's final days with a bureaucrat's clarity. These dry accounts show depositions of grain, lists of workers, and the allocation of bronze for weapons, small things that, when they stop or pivot, reveal the larger story. The bureaucracy is the body's underlying skeleton, and when it shifts, the shape of events follows. The night of the city's fall, as described by some accounts, was not a single cinematic moment but a chain of smaller movements. Soldiers moved through disused channels, through sewer and waterwork, through times when the sound of footsteps was muffled by gravel and the river's murmurs. A gate opened or was found vulnerable, sentries were bypassed or bribed. The palace did not always burn in classical descriptions. Often, the taking of power involved seizing the archive, the treasury, and the temple's symbolic heart. It was crucial for a conqueror to seize not merely land but legitimacy. The captor who could present himself as the restorer of order, the worshipper who returned statues to their shrines, the king who honored local rights, such a leader could govern without being loathed as a foreigner. Cyrus understood this in a way most of his predecessors did not. His inscriptions claim respect for local cults and justify conquest as a rectification rather than pure plunder. We should think of legitimacy as a kind of currency as real as gold. Priests, scribes, and elders had reputations to protect: the integrity of the cult, the sanctity of law, the continuity of lineage. When a new ruler offered to maintain or restore those things, they could rationalize collaboration as a preservation rather than betrayal. Such rationalization built the scaffolding for a new imperial order that would subsume Babylon but preserve its cultural rhythms. Yet betrayal is rarely transactional in only one direction. For many locals, aligning with Cyrus was a bet on survival, not a sentimental choice. The Persian ascent promised stability across a wider domain, the possibility of trade without constant interruption, the rule of law enforced by satraps and messengers rather than random brigands. That promise appealed to merchants, landowners, and even to some priests who calculated that their cult's longevity mattered more than the identity of the throne. Even so, the story of an empire's fall is not reducible to policy analysis. There are human textures, fear, hope, grief, that thread through every act. Women wept at the gates, children slept in the shadow of walls built by ancestors feeling now like fragile shells. Soldiers, too, had private calculations: hunger, fear, the desire for plunder, or the dread of being left behind should a siege fail. In these private folds lives the daily truth of history. When the city fell, the symbols mattered. Seizing the cylinder or reopening the temple had a theological effect as significant as the military one. The Babylonian pantheon was not a set of metaphors but a living force invoked daily through ritual. To handle the city's sacred objects was to claim control over the narrative of the city's future. Cyrus's reputed respect for those objects read to many as a sign that their worship would continue, albeit under new management. That management took practical form in the Persian imperial system, satrapies that granted local autonomy within a broader administrative framework. Babylon would remain important as a seat of tax collection, a center for agriculture and transport, and a cultural hub. The Persians were pragmatic rulers. They employed local elites as administrators and kept many existing institutions intact because doing so made governance cheaper and less violent. Still, governance under a different banner alters identity even when institutions remain. Language usage shifts, fiscal habits change, and the cosmopolitan network reorients toward new centers of command. For ordinary Babylonians, everyday life continued with a mixture of continuity and small, persistent differences: taxes payable to a new name, couriers bearing seals of unfamiliar symbols, soldiers speaking another tongue but wearing local armor. Identity is both robust and malleable, and in the months after conquest it flexes in ways both obvious and invisible. For the Jewish exiles in Babylon, the Persian takeover signified more than political recalculation. It offered a route home for communities long displaced, if the conqueror permitted such return. Cyrus's edicts, as preserved in scripture and in inscriptions, included gestures of repatriation and temple restoration. To those who had prayed for deliverance, such a policy read as the fulfillment of prophecy, entwining political change with religious vindication. That intertwining carried consequences that would ripple for centuries. The return of the exiles shaped the religious life of Judea, fueling reconstruction projects, law reform, and the rearticulation of identity in a post-exilic world. Babylon's fall thus reverberated outward, changing calendars and tombstones, marriages and market days, not only in Mesopotamia but in the small communities that would remember their time under Babylonian rule as a crucible of identity. On the material level, the city's monuments survived in ways both poignant and ruinous. The Ishtar Gate, with its lions and dragons, stood as a testament to the artisan's skill. The palaces continued to inspire awe. Yet over time neglect, silt, and later conquest wore at those stones, and what travelers would see centuries later were fragments of a once unified face. Archaeology would uncover those fragments and reconstruct them into a narrative that speaks to the simultaneous grandeur and fragility of human achievement. The Cyrus cylinder and other inscriptions are key tactile pieces of this story. Written in Akkadian but commissioned under a foreign name, they present conquest as liberation. They declare the return of cult images to their sanctuaries and praise the new king's piety. Modern scholars debate their propagandistic tone versus their representative reality, but either way, they articulate how conquerors construct moral narratives to legitimize rule. To win rule is to tell a story and to make that story stick. Art and architecture tell another part of the tale. The glazed bricks, the reliefs, the ceremonial ways, each element of Babylon was a public text that communicated power, mythology, and communal identity. When conquerors preserve those texts or leave them to ruin, they decide which voices continue to speak. Cyrus's apparent choice to preserve rather than erase reflects a long view. Empire is easier to govern when it appears in continuity rather than as a brutal reshaping every generation. Of course, not all losses were physical. The fall reshaped law and record-keeping too. The scribes who recorded economic transactions, legal decisions, and royal decrees found themselves working under different seals. The format of accounts persisted, but the names on the seals changed, and the banal act of writing a receipt now meant the state's revenue went to a different center. Those small administrative changes add up to a new rhythm of life. The wider geopolitical consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Babylon had been the center of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but with its absorption into the Persian imperial system, new axes of power emerged. The world of cities and plains, of caravan routes and fleet, reorganized around Persian control, creating a corridor from the Indus to the Aegean that would facilitate exchange and conquest alike. For a time, the region experienced an unprecedented scale of connectivity, and that scale reshaped trade, culture, and war. Culturally, the Persian era allowed for exchange rather than forced assimilation. Local cults continued, languages coexisted, and customs adapted to new legal frameworks. Such plurality creates a mosaic rather than a uniform culture, and in that mosaic Babylon retained a distinct tile. The city's identity survived as a local tradition within a larger imperial costume, and that survival influenced later Hellenistic and Roman impressions of Mesopotamia. Yet we cannot romanticize the aftermath as merely smooth integration. There were resistances, revolts, and episodes of unrest in various corners of the former Babylonian territory. Some groups chafed under foreign administrative demands, others mourned the loss of direct autonomy. Revolt and suppression repeated the ancient cycle: a city resists, a province rebels, and an empire recalibrates. These cycles remind us that political stability is often temporary, maintained by force and consent in fragile balance. Beyond politics and ritual, the human cost of such transitions is profound. Families split between those who wished to return to ancestral lands and those who had rooted themselves in Babylon faced wrenching decisions. Laborers who built monuments under one regime might find their contracts voided, and craftspeople saw markets change. Memory itself becomes a contested site, which stories endure, which names are preserved on monuments, which fierce ancestors are sung at a hearth remains a matter of choice and power. Language, too, is a living ledger. Akkadian and Aramaic interplayed in the city. The adoption of Aramaic as a lingua franca in the Persian Empire changed everyday speech. Akkadian continued in temple and palace records for a time, a learned tongue preserved by scribes and priests, but Aramaic opened commerce and conversation between peoples across the empire. Such linguistic shifts quietly make the world feel different within a generation. Consider also the intellectual climate. Astronomers, mathematicians, and scholars in Babylon did not vanish with a regime change. They continued to track the stars, to calculate eclipses, and to set the calendar. Their knowledge moved with the empire. Babylonian astronomy, for instance, influenced Greek and later Hellenistic science through postal routes and scholarly exchange. In this sense, even as political banners changed, intellectual currents flowed outward and persisted. Memory of the fall also enters the realm of myth and literature. Poets and priests shaped narratives that would inform generations. Babylon becomes a symbol in Judeo-Christian imagination, an emblem of pride brought low, and in later European literature it appears as the epitome of decadence. Such symbolic afterlives reveal more about those who retell the story than about the original events, but they also show how history is a resource for moral reflection across ages. At the same time, local narratives maintained their nuance. Many Babylonians might remember Cyrus as a practical ruler who allowed rituals to continue, not as a providential savior. Priests who reconsecrated temples after the conquest had their own set of responses rooted in survival and adaptation rather than gratitude alone. Memory is crowded with voices, and the past is less a single tale than a chorus of different recollections. The archaeology of ruin also catches the imagination: layers of ash, a sudden drop-off in building activity, or a rapid reuse of bricks reveal moments when normal life broke and resumed in different patterns. These layers tell a slow, physical story about disruption and resilience. In the rooms where officials once kept receipts, later hands wrote different names but followed similar forms, as if the apparatus of empire continued to hum while its name changed. There is a certain tragic beauty to that continuation. Buildings rebuilt on the foundations of older ones, rituals adapted to new patrons, languages layered like sediment, these are signs of human tenacity. The fall could have meant the end of a particular political structure, but it did not end the city's life entirely. Babylon became a chapter in a longer story rather than a terminal paragraph. Technological and infrastructural inheritance mattered too. Irrigation networks, particularly, dictated the agricultural productivity of the region. Whoever controlled Babylon controlled the management of canals and dams that fed the plain. Maintaining those works required administration and coercion, but it also meant that empire depended on technical know-how and that conquest meant inheriting a set of engineering obligations that were costly and complex. We should not overlook the moral dimensions that ancient writers attached to the events. To many contemporaries and to those who shaped the historical memory, Babylon's fall was a cautionary tale about arrogance and divine retribution. Poets and preachers used the city's demise to teach humility, arguing that wealth and splendor could not immunize a people from moral decline. That moral framing shaped how later generations talked about imperial hubris and divine justice. Yet another lens gives us economic reasons for collapse, overextension, fiscal strain, and the difficulty of sustaining a large state with expensive military commitments. Empires require resources both to expand and to maintain control over distant provinces. When revenues shrink or when administrative costs rise faster than income, states face the slow corrosion of capacity that makes them vulnerable to ambitious rivals. Babylon's own fiscal health was bound up with agriculture, trade along the Euphrates, and tribute from vassal states. Disruptions in any of those channels, poor harvests, loss of trade routes, expensive wars, translate swiftly into strain on the state's engines. A king distant from the capital or a treasury spent on grand projects rather than on soldiers could accelerate a decline that would otherwise have taken longer to surface. The human stories within the fall are rich and varied. There were soldiers who walked into a city that smelled of bread and sewage and found themselves negotiating for shelter with families who remembered earlier kindnesses. There were priests who calculated astrological charts and decided which rituals to keep in the face of uncertain patronage. There were mothers who packed small bundles and decided whether to flee toward unknown safety or remain within walls now contested. Each decision was small but accumulated into the large shape of history. Altitude matters in historical imagination. Conquerors are remembered for their campaigns, but administrators are remembered for their letters. The scribes who kept daily logs after the conquest shaped the record we inherit. Their lists of rations and barley distributions are not glamorous, but they show how orders moved and how ordinary people understood the new rule. In sweeping narratives, it's easy to forget that history is the sum of these mundane acts as much as of battlefield genius. Religious continuity in the wake of conquest also deserves emphasis. Temples reopened, priests resumed rites, and the public festivals that defined civic time continued, sometimes altered but often recognizable. Religious life provides a rhythm to everyday existence, the seasons marked by festivals, the legal calendar set by holy days. Maintaining those rhythms under new rule was a way of telling citizens that life could go on despite political turnover. Still, the psychological blow of watching a divine order apparently overturned was significant. When a people saw images of gods removed and replaced, it created cognitive dissonance. Even when idols were restored by new patrons, the very act of displacement left a memory: gods had been moved by human hands. That memory shaped theological reflection for priests and lay people alike, provoking questions about divine favor and human agency. And then there are the smaller ironies of history: a Persian official copying a Babylonian administrative model even as he represented a different rule, or a local artisan continuing to craft reliefs in an older style for a Persian patron. These ironies show that cultural habits persist through conquest, repurposed rather than destroyed. They also underscore that culture is a resource for rulers of all stripes. To rule is to manage continuity as much as it is to enact change. As centuries passed, the meaning of Babylon's fall shifted. For those living under the Persian umbrella, it became an administrative footnote. For Bible writers and later Christian and Islamic scholars, it became a symbol laden with moral and theological implications. For archaeologists centuries later, It became a physical site to be excavated, piecing together tablets and bricks to reconstruct a city that had once taxed empires and inspired myths. In modern archaeological practice, the delicate work of restoring names to fragments brought more specificity to the story. We learned to read cuneiform tablets for tax receipts and marriage contracts, and those small documents repopulate history with ordinary people. The fall of Babylon ceased to be merely a dramatic collapse and became a sequence of human situations, an administrative set of choices, economic disruptions, and personal reckonings. And yet some of the romance remains. The image of Cyrus entering Babylon with minimal bloodshed, the scene of a feast interrupted by a spectral hand, the gate opened from the inside. These dramatic motifs continue to captivate because they tell a good story. They compress complex causes into memorable images, and memory needs images. We tell them because we seek narratives that are easier to recall than the messy, distributed causes that build up over decades. Herodotus's versions and the Bible's parables operate in the same narrative economy. They create moral clarity and memorable scenes out of historical complexity. Scholars often push back, asserting structural causes over single moments, and both modes of explanation are useful. The dramatic episode makes history feel immediate. The structural analysis reminds us that empires fall not merely from a single night but from the accumulation of decisions and conditions. We should ask, too, about the victims of conquest. There were certainly people dispossessed, property stolen, and lives uprooted. But there were also those who benefited, perhaps artisans who gained new patrons or traders who found themselves in a larger market. Conquest is uneven in its effects. It devastates some and enables others. To understand the fall of Babylon is to hold these contradictory outcomes simultaneously. One of the more subtle legacies of Babylon's fall is how it shaped subsequent imperial models. The Persian approach of allowing cultural autonomy while maintaining administrative control influenced later empires, including the Greco-Roman and even some Ottoman practices. Conquerors who learned from the Persian example realized that indirect rule through local elites yielded stability. Thus, the fall of Babylon indirectly informed the architecture of empire for centuries to come. The city's later decline into ruin, and then excavation centuries later, created another narrative arc about memory and recovery. Early excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries unearthed artifacts that would be carried to museums in Europe, prompting debates about cultural heritage and the rightful place of antiquities. Those debates remind us that the story of Babylon's fall does not end when the city fell. It continues in the ethical questions about how we remember and steward the past. In the ruins, the very texture of time is visible. Bricks bearing royal inscriptions lie beside simple household pots. The grand facades of palaces have left only a flattened impression on the soil. People walking through such sites feel both the weight of history and the fragility of human achievement. The fall of Babylon is thus a lived lesson. Greatness can be both striking and ephemeral. There is also a literary afterlife to consider. Western literature, in particular, has reused Babylon as a trope for decadence, confusion, and hubristic fall. Poets and novelists have woven its imagery into meditations on modern power, invoking the city's gates to symbolize the collapse of moral order. While such appropriations can oversimplify, they also show how ancient events continue to illuminate modern anxieties about empire and morality. Across all these strands, military, religious, economic, cultural, the fall of Babylon becomes a layered case study in how human systems give way. It was not merely a military triumph of Cyrus over Nabonidus, it was a confluence of neglect, priestly discontent, administrative shifts, economic pressures, and the tactical craft of a calculated conqueror. Each element amplified the others until the city, so secure for so long, found its gates opened, whether by a bribe, a sluice, or a change of faith. To listen to the fall of an empire is to hear many small sounds converge, the scritch of a scribe's stylus stopping, the low chant of a priest left lonely, the whisper of a soldier drawing breath before a plunge into the riverbed. Those small sounds become a chorus that outlasts the clamor of bronze and the flash of victory. The fall of Babylon teaches that history is not only in proclamations and battles but in the tiny human acts that, together, compose the fate of cities. Finally, there is an ethical echo. The biblical prophets used Babylon's fall to speak of justice and humility, but the story also asks modern listeners to reflect on how societies hold power and how fragile those holdings are. Hegemony can shelter the comfortable for a time, but the conditions that allow complacency to grow often sit unseen until they become decisive. Babylon's end invites us to think not only about the past but about the present, how we steward institutions, respect diverse voices, and remain vigilant against the slow corrosion of civic bonds. Long after the royal names faded from oral memory, the city's stone spoke to travelers and scholars, pot shards whispered the details of daily life, and the steady river continued to carry trade and rumor. In that continuity there is both melancholy and hope. Melancholy because no political form is eternal, hope because cultural life often survives through adaptation. The fall of Babylon thus becomes less a closing curtain and more a hinge that opened onto new forms of political and cultural life across the ancient Near East. This story, with its prophecies, betrayals, and consequential aftermath, invites careful listening because it is not merely about the past. It is an invitation to understand how power, belief, and pragmatic choices intersect. The fall of Babylon is a tale that returns in different guises whenever a society must reconcile sacred tradition with political necessity, and whenever leaders must decide whether to rule by fear or by respect. In study and in imagination, it remains an enduring mirror of human governance. So the city that once declared itself the center of the world did not vanish so much as transform. Its fall, recorded in holy texts and state cylinders, dramatized in classical histories and reconstructed in modern digs, reveals the complexity of human affairs. That fall has become a prism through which later ages view the interplay of faith and power, and its reverberations continue to shape how we think about empire, legitimacy, and the fragile architecture of civic life. When you imagine the last night before the gates opened, consider the small domestic scenes as well as the grand gestures: a lantern guttering in a courtyard, a priest pausing mid-rite, a soldier tightening his belt for unknown duty. Those moments, tiny as they may seem, are where history lives most fully. The end of an empire is not a single explosive event but a tapestry of human choices braided together until the last stand is only an echo of all that came before. And in the long aftermath, when new rulers ruled from palaces that bore older stones, the people of the city kept on living, children were born, markets reopened, festivals continued in altered form. Continuity did not erase loss, and loss did not erase memory. The fall of Babylon, then, remains a profound reminder that human worlds are fragile yet resilient, subject to collapse and yet capable of renewal in forms no one could predict at the moment the first gate was opened. Cities fall, people keep living. Subscribe and write in the comments what speaks louder to you, the ruins left behind or the courage to start again.